So what is the Caro-Kann defense? The Caro-Kann defense in a classical sense is e4, c6, just a sec, let me maybe disable the sound. e4, c6, d4, d5. There you go. This is the Caro-Kann defense. So what are we going to talk about here in this episode is how to build yourself an easy repertoire with black against e4. And then I will also talk about what could be your repertoire that you could use together with the Caro against d4, against c4, and what are the similarities with other openings. But for the start, we're going to start with the Caro-Kann. The Caro, you might be a bit surprised. The Caro at a good level is considered to be an aggressive continuation. You might be thinking, wait a second, how? How it's aggressive? This is not aggressive. It's clearly positional. No. So I have talked with some really high-level chess professionals, and most of them, they answer to me the same. They treat the Caro as an aggressive repertoire. Why is this? Because when you're playing chess at a pretty good level, although we're not going to talk super GM level here, I'm mainly going to focus on the ideas, you are avoiding a symmetrical position. Yes, this will be on YouTube as well, something like a week later, but yes, it will be on YouTube as well. So, but I think it's a better idea probably to watch it while it's live, when you get to ask some questions about the Caro-Kann, some ideas, or something is not very clear. So the point is of the Caro is that it's pretty difficult for your opponent to get a symmetrical structure. And I think that this is something that has bothered probably all of you. When you are playing against a nominally weaker opponent and that guy starts to play for a draw against you, it's so annoying. You know, especially e4, e5, all kinds of 4 knights variation. Your opponent trades queens, he trades every single piece, and then he basically begs for a draw. I mean, I think that all of us, we have been in this situation when you're like, oh my goodness, really? Let's just play chess, right? But no, your opponent is not really interested. All he wants is a draw. That's why the Caro is often regarded as a defense which is very difficult to liquidate into a draw. And that's why it is championed by many high-level players, because you simply do not get those symmetrical positions. Of course, I'm immediately going to step in and say you can always find draws in any line. That's the curse of black. But it's going to require white quite a bit of imagination to get there. So normally in main lines, there is no symmetricality. So let's start with the basics. Why are we playing c6? Why we are not playing e5? Why we are not playing d6 or d5? Why we are not playing c5? Well, c5 is obviously the very sharp Sicilian defense. And with the move of c6, with the very basics, we want to play d5, and we want to fight for the center. Now, the Caro defense, the Caro-Kann, basically this is a combination of two masters. Caro, what was his name? Caro, one guy was Caro, the other guy was Khan. And they started basically to develop the system together, not together, but separately, I think at the same time, and eventually the system, yes, Horatius, Caro, Marcus Khan. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't really check the history, but it doesn't matter in this case. So it's a combination of two last names, and they came up with this concept that you can play d5 and fight for the center. And why not d5 immediately? Because white plays e takes on d5, which is perfectly okay still for black. Black plays queen d5, and now the point is after knight c3, your queen has to move. And then, of course, somebody's going to step in and say, hey, no bad words about Scandinavian defense, right? I mean, of course, this is still a perfectly playable opening. Black plays either queen d6 or queen a5. Some people even preserve queen d8, whatever. But it's a different system and different character. So we are going to play c6. We want to play d5. And our approach is, obviously, we want to fight for the center. Because whenever you are classifying openings, at least I classified openings this way. I think that there are three ways of openings, three categories of openings. So category number one, you're immediately fighting for the center. So I'm talking about e4, e5. I'm talking about d4, d5. I'm talking about c4, c5. So these are very often the most popular openings, so you have to influence the center. The second type of openings are where you kind of neglect the center, at least immediately, but you try to counter-strike it, right? So that's why there's the Sicilian defense, there's the Dutch defense, there's the French defense. French defense will be e6, d5. And there's the Caro-Kann defense. So you play c6, d5. So at the moment, you kind of ignore the center, but you're about to counter-attack it. And then there's the third type of defenses where you basically ignore the center. And that's why, dear viewers, don't do this. Yeah, I mean, that's why I'm saying don't play b6, bishop b7. This is, whatever is this? Owen's opening. Don't play g6, bishop g7. Don't play e6, d6. Don't play c6, d6. Don't play, whatever, knight c6, d6. As long as you are not fighting for the central squares, you are giving your opponent way too much freedom. That's why one of the most important principles whenever we are starting to talk about the opening theory, you have to fight for the center. Because very often, for example, we compare with football, the one who controls the middle of the field is closer to start an attack and can faster run back to the defense. That's why. It's really that simple. So you can ignore the center, but bad things are about to happen to you, right? So that's why we are playing c6. We want to play d5, and naturally we're using the pawns to generate the targets, and we're fighting for space. And space naturally is a big part of chess. So we are going to start with the classical variation. And the classical variation is obviously d4. And, you know, I might be an old-fashioned guy, but I strongly believe in some clear opening principles. And those are, if your opponent allows you to play e4, d4, do it. It's really that simple. So the same applies for black. If your opponent allows you to play e5, d5, do it. I mean, immediately take the center. Typical excuse for those players who are afraid to do it's like, I don't know the opening theory here. But I mean, come on, guys. I mean, this is clearly the best move in the position. And take the center, worry about things later, right? So here we are playing d5. And now the threat is pretty obvious. We want to take on e4. And this is where pretty big theory actually starts. But as you are going to see in this bootcamp, it's not really that difficult. And throughout the history, some really great players have championed this defense. If I would have to name the biggest one, probably that would be Anatoly Karpov. From the current generation, I would say pretty much all the greatest players. Right now, they're playing their fair share of Caro. Also, my current student, one of the most popular content creators, Gotham Chess, as you know, he's a huge fan of the Caro defense. Why? Because it's easy. It's easy to learn, and it has a very good reputation. By the way, speaking about reputation, this is something that I would strongly advise to all of you inquire before you start to study an opening. Is this opening having a good reputation or not? Caro-Kann is one of the best, has one of the best reputations. So you might study the Latvian gambit and you are investing a lot of hours trying to make it work. But it has a pretty bad start, and I'm a Latvian grandmaster. I hate to say it, but Latvian defense is terrible. I wish we had a better defense. So it really makes sense to, before you invest your time, by let's say getting a course or getting some coaching, inquire information. Is this setup you're choosing good or not? The repetition. Yeah, Gotham is my student. So now white has a couple of choices. So the move is knight c3. So we're going to start by move knight c3. I think it's the most reasonable move because white develops another piece and is fighting for the center. Now, one thing you have to know about this continuation is that this has basically become obsolete at a high level. And probably some of you are like, wait, what are you talking about? I mean, knight c3 is the move, right? I mean, you're developing piece, you're fighting for the center. No. Theory is moving on. And now there are different trends in opening theory. If you would check right now any games at a highest level, you will basically find almost no knight c3. The main reason is that e5, the advanced variation, has become so popular that basically everybody plays it right now. I still very clearly remember that the advanced variation, something like, whatever, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was like a sideline. This is the main continuation right now. And if you want to be trendy, you are playing the advanced variation. With h4, exactly. With h4, everybody plays h4. Like 90% of the people, they're playing e5, bishop 5, h4. I'm going to talk about it. So, but let's check first knight c3 and try to understand what is the reason why the knight c3 continuation is no longer played at a good level. And you're going to score very good results on this line. So, we have to take on e4. We have to. Because if you look at the position, you simply are running out of reasonable moves. By the way, one thing whenever you are studying opening theory, I would really advise you to have the question why. You know, let's say you're getting an advice from somebody and this expert says to you, you have to do this. And you're asking why. The answer is because I said so. You know, I think it's pretty ridiculous. So there needs to be like a pretty clear understanding why you're doing this. And you know why? Because there might be a similar position. And if you don't understand the goals that you're trying to achieve, you will have a major problem to improvise. That's why. So why do you have to take on e4? As I already said, you simply are running out of good moves. So the alternative would be knight f6, try to hit the center. It feels like a great move, but now the problem is white plays e5. So you're losing tempi, and if you are considering to play something like knight e7, now look at the position a bit further. For example, I didn't really check this line any deeply, so let's say white plays maybe f4, e6, knight f3, you probably have to play c5. You're playing a French defense, a terrible version of the French defense. That's why. So after knight f6, if white plays e5 and you try to play knight e4, the knight on e4 maybe is not so well positioned. And typically you have to watch out for moves like knight e2. Knight e2, f3, and the knight might be in trouble. That's why. And basically because of this problem, I mean, you could also play g6. It does not have a good reputation. It simply does not have a good reputation because white again at some point is going to play the advanced variation e5. Your bishop on g7 will be staring in the face of the pawn on e5. The knight cannot jump to f6 and it's simply worse. That's why you have to take. It's as simple as that. So here white takes on e4 and now the understanding of the opening theory has evolved because if you look historically how this line was played, I mean there used to be 1, 2, 3, 4 major continuations. No, wait. 1, 2, 3. Sorry, 3. I can't count. 3 major continuations. So bishop f5 was by far the main continuation some time ago. Then also Anatoly Karpov, he used to play knight e7 with the idea to get the knight on f6. And of course there was also knight f6. With the idea that after knight takes and f6, people used to experiment with g takes and f6 and it kind of complicates the game. And this is where it gets really interesting. It used to be the assessment of this position that e takes on f6 gives white slightly better chances because black has a pawn majority at the queen side, and then in the long run, in a quiet positional game, white gets the better chances. This was the belief, this was the understanding of this setup. This is the so-called Tartakover variation. That's why, for many, many years, the main continuation here was bishop f5, which I believe is still completely fine. So you want to bring out the bishop to play e6. I mean, this bishop belongs on this, on this diagonal. Definitely, I mean, it is also, of course, possible to play g6, bishop g7, but bishop f5 is just pretty normal. You want to play e6, and basically here, white pretty much instantly plays knight g3. You play bishop g6, and now it really depends on the player. To be honestly, I'm not really sure what's the big difference. Some players like to include h4, some players are not including h4, so h4 makes quite a bit of sense. White wants to trap the bishop. You have to play h6, otherwise with h5 your pawn will be always a target on h5. That's why you don't want to play h5. So you play here, white plays knight f3. Again, sometimes white includes h5, sometimes white does not include h5, so he starts with knight f3. And his big idea is to play knight e5. Now remember this idea. So white wants to play knight e5 and hit your bishop on g6. Now the main continuation here is knight e7, but there are nuances because black stops knight e5 and the white typically continues. Now it typically includes h5, bishop d3, trades the bishops. Now black plays e6, black plays knight f6, and we get this position. And this is a very, very important theoretical position because black is kind of slightly cramped, but one of the big strategies in this position is that black in the long run is kind of trying to make the pawn on h5 to be a weakness. So black is thinking about some future ideas like anchoring the knight on d5, playing b5, a5, a4, and the knight on d5 feels really great. So the big question is where black positions the king. Because if you position on the short side, you are kind of risking running into a direct attack. This is usually where the theory goes. So knight e4, knight e4, knight f6, queen e2, queen d5. These are typical maneuvers. Hitting the pawn here, but mainly trying to trade off the queens. So takes, 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 bishop e3. And now the question is, are you happy with this line? So there are a lot of games in this line. White is kind of slightly better. But black is saying, basically, in the long run, now this pawn is going to be a weakness. For example, something like long castle, rook e8, and maybe I get to play f5 in some moment. Yeah, so I get to play f5, knight f6, perhaps get this pawn, protect the pawn on e6, and, you know, try to outplay you in a slow positional game. There's also this trick. Sometimes black is trying to be smart. Black doesn't play knight e7 right here. And black plays e6. And that's a tricky move. Because if white again is unaware and white doesn't play knight e5, white plays h5, white plays bishop d3, same position. We play knight f6, bishop d2, bishop e7, castle, castle. So you're looking at this position, you're thinking it's exactly the same, right? No. One of the core ideas for black is to play c5, knight c6 in this position. So not develop the knight on d7. So let's say white plays something like king b1 or some random move. You want to play c5. If there's a trade, you trade the queens and you simply ruin white's pawn structure. And then you play here and play knight c6. And again, in the longer run, this pawn is a weakness. So we trade queens, we trade rooks, and this pawn becomes vulnerable. Imagine this, queens are gone, rooks are gone. I play bishop d6, take on g3, I take the pawn on h5. That's why white very often is having this dilemma. Should he play h5 or not? So it's really tricky. It's not really so simple to understand. But here's the catch. If black plays e6, it allows white to play knight e5 immediately because you did not play knight e7. And now white suddenly has this very powerful idea to play f4, f5. Why is it given an inaccuracy for the top line, top engine? Which inaccuracy? Did I give any inaccuracy here? No, I didn't see any inaccuracy. But this line is dangerous. I think that from a practical point of view, I would not go here. And I think that e6 is kind of, no, it's not inaccuracy. I just wrote it's an interesting move. It's an interesting move. Yeah, if you're looking for knight f6, bishop e7, show castle and c5 to get the knight on c6, that is pretty interesting. But again, a smart player is going to play knight e5 because he's going to notice the difference. Right. So, but anyway, listen. Even this is not even played right now. I mean, I think that if bishop f5 was still the main move in this position, the classical variation would be still popular today. Again, knight g3, bishop g6, this entire system, h4, h6, knight f3, knight e7, because here Stockfish kind of equalizes for black. There's no real issues. There's a lot of games, and white has to be super creative to prove the advantage here. But there's the problem. There is the problem, the viewers, and it is the knight f6 move. And the evaluation of this system has basically, it's basically the reason why this setup for white no longer is so popular. Now, why? Why this is the problem? So we are going to start with a move. Now, I think white has to take knight f6, yeah, because something like knight g3, it just feels wrong. And okay, even though you have problems to develop your bishop here, think about one typical idea in the Caro. You play g6, bishop g7, which is a typical idea in the Scandinavian, because the Caro-Kann defense and the Scandinavian, they share some similarities. And with g6 and bishop g7, the knight on g3 for white becomes really silly. Knight g5, okay, that's a bit advanced. I see. Tak, yeah, you already wrote it. That's a bit advanced variation, so we are not going to look at it. We are not going to look at all the tricks here. White has definitely more moves here, but we are going to focus on knight f6. After a knight f6, you want to play e takes on f6. That's the alien gambit. Yeah, I see. I didn't check it. Maybe I'll have to add an update in the PGN. I didn't check the alien gambit. Now, this is a very, very solid setup. And as I already said, it used to be, it was believed that white has the better position here. Because if we remove every single piece of the board, like we remove bishops, we remove rooks, we remove the queens. Now you see white simply has a better pawn structure at the queen side, and then at any queen endgame, white is planning to win. That's the plan. But what has changed essentially in the understanding of the Caro is that although black doubles the pawns, he has a very healthy development, meaning it's very easy to play. So you're going to go here, you're going to go somewhere here, the knight is coming out, so you have no issues. And that essentially is the change in understanding of the position. By the way, there's some similarity to the pawn structure compared with the Berlin variation in the Ruy Lopez, because also very often blacks play g6 f5, and this is typically what black does in the so-called Berlin endgame. So here white typically plays c3, and this is where a lot of players start to go wrong. So c3 seems to be necessary, but white would have to understand that this knight is not going to f3, because if he plays knight f3, there's no good squares to go. And that's why the best setup for white is to play c3, bishop d3, and knight e2. And I think you're going to see that this setup for black is very easy to play, because here after c3, you're putting the bishop on d6. White plays bishop d3. And now actually the big theory here is short castle, queen c2, rook e8 check, knight e2, and now the pawn is under attack. And it's very important to understand here, how do you defend this pawn? Because now if you play something like g6, you're running under attack, because white's going to play bishop e3, long castle, c4, knight c3, open up the h file, and you're in trouble. You can't do it. So the safer move might be h6, but by playing h6, you're kind of losing dynamics in the position. And these pawns you have at the king side, they become static. So that's why here the main move is this very surprising move h5, which is maybe, not a big surprise to the Caro-Kann fans. And you are planning to do the following things, like you play knight e7. Typically, you have two ideas here. You're thinking about playing b5, knight b6, fighting for these squares and pushing for the queenside pawns, giving you a very easy game. But again, you have to understand that your opponent will do exactly the same to you, and essentially it's a race. So very often it feels like it's a more cautious response to play knight f8. You bring the knight closer to the king's defense. And here, for example, king b1, bishop e6. Again, you want to play b5, a5, b4, a4. So white tries to close this bishop with c4, and eventually you're playing something like b5. So this is a pretty common idea. After b5, if white takes the pawn, you just open up a lot of files. The king is in danger. This pawn, it doesn't matter. And if white plays something like c5, you retreat to the bishop, and you get a very nice outpost on d5. So at least in theory. So that's why here white could play something like h3, and this is, I think, a mistake. So white is thinking about g4, because now you play bishop d5, very typical maneuver, and this pawn on g2 is very difficult to defend. Like here, b5, g4, and there's already bishop h2 with some problems, the rook is under attack, but even h4, closing the king side, makes perfect sense. And you are just being very careful. Whatever happens at the king side, and black's chances at some point already become better. So either way, the position is very sharp. And maybe bishop g5, you're thinking about queen e6, getting the pawn here. And black very often, in these positions, black takes over the game. But what I don't like about this line is that it is heavily researched. Now, this is obviously huge theory. Playing short castle, rook e8, and h5. But there's a simpler line. And I have to confess where my knowledge about this line comes from. I watched some YouTube series several years ago, done by one of the greatest experts in the Caro-Kann, Alexander Ryazantsev. He was Alexander, right? Think so. Ryazantsev. So he was a 2700 ELO grandmaster, one of the greatest experts of the Caro defense. And he was having this amazing video series about the Caro, although in Russian language. And I speak Russian language because it's my second, or now it's the third language. And he was recommending this move, knight a6. And that's the move I also recommended to Levy. And I believe he played it once. So the point here with knight a6, we are going for the same position, but we are avoiding the short castle immediately, and you're going to see the difference. And now here, it's very tempting for white to take on a6, because it kind of ruins the pawn structure for black, right? So bishop a6 for some might be a no-brainer, because, I mean, look at your horrible pawn structure. But when you look at the position a bit deeper, you start to realize that white will have problems with the light squares. Or maybe even in some similar lines, let's say white plays something like this. Yeah, there's rook e2, or you go back. But you want to position the bishop on b7 and play c5. So you see suddenly this bishop becomes a monster. And the fact that black has this weakness on a6, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could actually trade it at some point by playing a5, a4, rook b8, b3, a5, a4, bishop b7, c5, and this bishop becomes, pardon for the wrong diagonal, it becomes really powerful. So white cannot take it, especially considering he already wasted tempi for bishop d3. So look at this, yeah? He played bishop d3, you play knight a6. I mean, is he gonna now take on a6? And this maneuver in knight a6 is a very common maneuver in the Tartakover variation, in this Neiksans system. We want to get the knight on c7 and postpone the castle. So white typically plays something like knight e2, because one of the ideas is to play bishop f4, counter this powerful bishop. You play knight c7. Let's say white plays bishop f4. Now you play castles. White goes here, short castle. And I believe you have more than one way to play out this position, but probably the simplest one is you play bishop g4. You take on e2. You can also, of course, play bishop h5 and bishop g6. It's not an issue. And this is just an equal position. Actually, you know, it's pretty amazing, because an engine even tends at some moments to evaluate this position in favor for black. I suppose because the bishop on d3 is kind of useless, so you want to play f5 to limit the bishop on d3, play rook e8, try to keep at least one heavy piece on the board, and then look for targets. Maybe put the knight at f4 and ask white some serious questions. So you do not want to trade the knight for the bishop in this position. So, okay, I mean, objectively, black doesn't have an advantage, but you have no issues whatsoever. So if white plays something like, let's say, castles, you castle, white goes here. Now you can play g6. This is not a problem. You see, no longer h4, h5 is going to be an issue. That's why, again, I think it's very important for you to understand which maneuvers are when possible, and the main reasoning why. Why you gonna play g6 when white doesn't castle short? Because he's gonna play a long castle and play h4, h5. Why we cannot play g6? Because now h4, h5 is not a problem. So white can go here, 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 and the game just continues. Typical maneuvers like a5, f5, knight e6. Yeah, by the way, typical square for the knight is on e6. And here's the trick. Now this is a position where white tends to misplay the position from time to time. Because when you look at the position, it seems the pawn on d5 is a pass pawn. It's a great pass pawn. But actually, because of this pawn on d5, white very often has problems. Hey, Justin, how are you doing? So the game could continue something like this. Something like this. So you want to get the knight on e4, maybe knight f6, the bishop could go here. The pawn becomes a problem, and black's piece activity is just amazing. That's one of the greatest mistakes that white usually does in this position. They push d4, d5, and then they realize the pawn is going nowhere further, and black is just having a super solid position, and quite often the pawn in d5 just drops. So let's go back a bit. And now instead of this knight e2, knight c7, you might ask, what's the difference? Why white doesn't play queen c2? White can play queen c2 with the idea to long castle. Now g6 is not great. Black plays bishop h6, but now we play h5. h5. And you see, we are reaching the same position where was this very big theory with a short castle, but we have not castle. Because the logic is, why do we castle short to play h5 and then protect the king if we can keep the king in the center I mean, we can even play king f8, g6 and king g7. The king is going to be feeling much more secure this way. So we are saving some time. And it's not even clear if the rook always needs to be on e8. So white has here a couple of choices. For example, white goes something like knight g3. By the way, this is what Levy's opponent played in New York. One of his opponents in the penultimate round. And black immediately gets a nice game with h4. Levy remembered it correctly. Knight f5. This is what his opponent played. Takes, g6. White has two bishops. But black is just doing fantastic. I mean, look at this. Here, Levy did not find the move h3, g3, and f4. And black is better. Because with this pawn on h3, for example, takes. And if I remember correctly, Levy said that he even saw this line, but he was not sure how good it is. Well, black again is simply better because the knight is anchored on f4, and because of the pawn on h3, white is always kind of annoyed in an endgame. So there's this continuation with knight g3, which again is not dangerous. White could play something like a short castle, and I think that these short castles are pretty soft. You should never be afraid in the Caro, the Tartakova variation, if white plays the short castle. It's just very easy game for you. Again, white obviously is not in trouble, but neither are you. So you play knight e5, and now you play something like king f8. Again, you want to play g6, king g7, maybe f5 at some point to limit the activity of these bishops. So, yeah, you just develop the pieces. Again, same structure, h4, h3, allow him to take here, you play b5. You see, black's setup repeats all the time. Put the knight on d5, put the bishop on e6, aggressively push those pawns to secure the outpost on the knight on d5. And also, in some future lines, you're thinking about to exploit those weakened light squares. And black has very good chances again to take over the game. So if white plays b3, c4, it does weaken the pawn on d4. So I'm not really sure. Let's say white goes here, here, c4. White needs to watch out that there's going to be not a very dangerous counterplay against the pawn on d4. All right. So as I already said, the most ambitious way for white to play is the long castle. So white typically plays bishop d2, and this is something that really good players, they're going to know that this is the best setup, because white wants a castle long and to play c4, knight c3. So this is considered to be the absolutely best flexible setup. Everything else is kind of less. So again, now you play king f8, you don't castle short, and that's why white's entire idea of h3, g4 just becomes ridiculous. Because your rook is on h8 and you didn't castle short against the direct attack. So white goes something like c4 most likely, you play g6, white goes here, you put the king on g7, white goes here, and now you just block it with h4. So something like, yeah, I'm not really sure if f4 or here, a5. This is a pretty important trade to trade off this annoying knight, and now you push b5. The point is you want to play against a bad bishop. For example, white goes here, you play bishop e6, queen e5, you're completely dominating those light squares, and b5, b4 is also an incoming threat. And yeah, I'm not really sure what white's supposed to do. Maybe go here, you can play here, think about bishop e6, or even put the knight on d5, play bishop a6, and again, the queen side belongs to you. And when you look at this position, it's not even clear if white's two bishops matter at all. I would say they do not. But again, this important maneuver is to remember bishop b4. Bishop b4, bishop c3, and b5. This is not really that difficult. So white typically plays c4, knight c3, you play a5, bishop b4, and take on c3. The knight is really strong. Hello, Robert. What else? Maybe white can decide not to play b5, and white plays something like a long castle. Now you play b5. I think you want to include this move as soon as white castles long, Again, your idea is to play a5 and bishop e6 and put the knight on d5. So let's say white goes here, you go here, you go here, g4, a4, you ignore the king side. You see there's even no need for you to play h4 because g takes on h5 is not a problem. Your rook on h8 does exactly perfect job. So here, just a nice game. Or maybe something else like white goes here, takes, rook h2, and suddenly the rook is very active. What happens if white castles short, as I already said, it's not dangerous. So you basically can execute the same ideas. Let's say bishop d3, knight a6, here. I already showed this line. Castles, now you can castle short safely, no problem. So you want to play g6, f5. Think about putting the knight typically can go to e6. White has to be careful about playing c4. So you can put the knight on e6, rearrange your pieces. You can play knight e5, secure the pawn with b5, a5, b4. Again, like I already said, you have a lot of very easy plans to execute. And if white plays c4, typically the knight stands really great on e6 to apply pressure. And if white plays d5, you just go back and the pawn becomes a problem. Yeah, so let's say g6, f5. Put the knight maybe on f6 or put the bishop on f6, knight on d6, block the pawn, and it's, again, an easy game. So, in a nutshell, obviously there's more lines, but I hope you understand. This is exactly the reason why, at a higher level, knight c3 is obsolete. Exactly because of this line. And not because of bishop f5, knight g3, bishop, which again is perfectly fine, but because of knight f6, because of these lines. And I'm not going to go as far as say that it's because of knight a6, Ryazantsev's recommendation. Maybe even this main line with short castle, queen c2, rook e8, knight e2, h5 is just great, because some of the best theoreticians in the world, they play exactly this line. And they're proving that it's fantastic. But to be honest, as I already said, it's a very complex line, and you have to know it quite a bit. And that's why I think that this knight a6 is a very worthy, a very simple alternative, because you execute the same idea, you kick your opponent out of the opening prep, and then at some point you play g6, g6, and king g7. Only thing maybe I forgot to mention is that here you have to be a bit careful. If you play h5 and your opponent plays something like bishop d2, you have to be a bit careful not to miss any bishop sacrifice on g6. Yeah, make sure you don't miss this. Like here, if you play it at the wrong moment, maybe your opponent can surprise you with a pretty strong attack. Yeah, this is something you don't want to miss it. So normally it doesn't work for white, but there are moments when it works. So if you have doubts about it, just delay it. Just delay it, right? And play something like a5 or b5, a4, and then look for the right moment to play the g6, and that's it. Maybe you could even play the position without the g6 move at all. Bluebum recently won a game with the short castle on early c5 instead of knight a6. Oh, you mean from the black's perspective? Oh yeah, sure. There's many setups. But I think that we can basically conclude our overview of this setup and just agree that black's game is very simple. So white already needs to know quite a bit. White needs to know bishop d3, queen c2, knight d2, bishop d2 along castle. This is the most ambitious setup. You're going to play knight a6, knight c7, h5, put the king on f8, and then think about b5, a5, bishop e6, knight e5, etc. with a very easy game. And let me reveal you a small secret. I would be playing the Caro without a hesitation with black as my main generation if I knew that my opponent will be playing the classical variation. I would totally do it. I would totally go for the Tartakova, because there's so many ideas, so many rich possible positions where black's not worse, and in the long run he's taking over the game. The problem, as I already said at the very beginning, it's the advanced variation. But the advanced variation, it is becoming the main continuation for many players already at a higher level. So I believe at a starting level, at the club level, there's a very fair chance that your opponents, they're not going to go for the advanced variation because not everybody possesses this knowledge. Okay, that is about the knight c3. Now, naturally, I will, as already said, I will post the PGN on my Patreon. So in case somebody is interested for the full PGN, you can get it on my Patreon. It will be available for the supporters and the VIP members. The bootcamp itself is free. And yes, this will be on YouTube, like a week later. Probably I will post it on YouTube tomorrow. Not on YouTube, but on my Patreon tomorrow. But yeah, on YouTube it will be available in full version, so you're not going to miss it. In case you're missing today the live stream, you can always, of course, watch it on YouTube as well. Okay, but as you're probably aware, that d4, d5, and knight c3 is not the only continuation. Yes, and I already see the question by counting blunders. Did I cover the recommendations against the two knights? Yeah, we are going to do it. So, now the next topic we are going to talk about is the two knights variation. e4, c6, and knight f3. Okay, you know, it doesn't really matter because sometimes white starts with knight c3, which comes with the idea that white keeps the option to play the classical variation with d4, or white keeps the option to play knight f3. Lately, a more trendy move order is knight f3, because then after d5, there's this fancy move d3. I'm going to talk about it in this bootcamp and explain why d3 is becoming a very trendy move. But for the sake of the, for the sake of the argument, we're going to keep it this move order. And now this is the so-called two knights variation. The two knights variation obviously has a very rich history. But the main idea why white is going for this setup, apparently players had discovered that this position basically almost by force gives white the two bishop advantage. And why this is so important? Because the two bishop advantage at the professional circles has often been labeled as the so-called minimal advantage you can get out of the opening. Somebody maybe is thinking like, what? What minimal advantage? Knight is equal to bishop, right? No, they're not equal. Because when you think about the knights and bishops, bishops best operate obviously in open positions. I mean, everybody knows that, right? At least I think so. And knights are better in closed positions. But when you start to think about your pieces, your games, how many of your games until the end remain closed with a closed character? Think about it. How many of your games remain closed? Well, not a lot, right? I mean, actually, I don't think you can even name like any game at all. Like, we've had completely closed position and your knights are reigning supreme. I think that like 95% of your games are open at some point. Every single position tends to open up. And that's why at a good level, players have discovered that it's a good idea to get the bishop advantage very early on, because the trend for the positions is to open up. And when the positions open up, the power of the bishop increases. That's it. That's the secret. And it is very popular at the title level. There's so many openings that feature the so-called minimal two bishop advantage, including the two knights variation. So basically here we have two continuations. The main continuation is bishop g4, but I think I'm going to recommend you something else for the sake of simplicity. There is no knight f6. We would love to play knight f6. And it seems that if white takes on d5 were fantastic, right? But now the issue again is with this e5 move. The knight is under attack. And you might remember already this line. With knight e4, there's knight e2. There's some theory here. All you need to know, this is a bad line for black. So you go here. I mean, otherwise, your knight is lost. You have to do this. So you play queen b6 to try to win a mate. White plays d4. You have to play e6, otherwise how else do you complete your development? White goes knight g3. And now there's this crazy line after bishop d3, knight g3, and f takes on g3. This is fully supported by Stockfish. White opens up the file to attack the pawn on f7, and after c takes, white just ignores the pawn on d4, plays something like a3, stopping your knight b4, you play bishop b7, white plays queen e2, and white just slaughters black typically in this position. So this position already is very dangerous for black. You're up a pawn, but you have no counterplay, and white is having all the fun at the king side. So let's say you go here, knight g5, goodbye. You're basically done immediately, like bishop g5, bishop g5, bishop f6, queen h5. Let's start the next game. I mean, your pieces are kind of in the wrong place. So this entire setup for black, knight f6, is just a mistake. You can't do it. And also, knight e7 is just a bad French defense. You're blocking your bishop, white plays d4, and you're playing e6, c5 with a waste of time. You're supposed to play the French defense c5 immediately. So it's just not working. And that's why you simply have no choice. I mean, you do have a choice between d takes on e4 and bishop g4. And now here after bishop g4, this is, by the way, sometimes the choice of Levy. He chooses between d takes on e4 and bishop g4. White plays h3, and bishop h5, there's a long variation, which I'm not going to show you. Is kind of playable for black, but black is worse. So you pretty much have to take it, and there you go. White gets the so-called minimal 2-bishop advantage. So black plays e6. White plays something like bishop e2, there's g3, bishop g2, there's d3. But all you need to know is that the position is pretty locked, but it will have the tendency to open up. So you might remember this game. This was Gotham Chess's game in Madrid, round 1 against Thomas Sosa. He started his journey back to the he journeyed to the Grandmaster title with a spectacular victory with the black color. This was exactly the same setup. So Sosa knew, of course, what he's supposed to do in the opening theory, that he has to bishop, he has to open up the position. And I think he just misplayed it. He was supposed to play something like bishop d1, c3, knight e2, c3, d4, and have a slightly better position, but objectively it's just balanced. Okay, maybe that is not really so relevant, but I'm about to suggest you to play d takes on e4 and knight f6. Why? For the sake of simplicity. By the way, here, do you remember what I told you about this old line? After c6, d4, d5, knight c3 takes, knight e4, bishop f5. Do you remember this setup? Knight g3, bishop g6, h4, h6, knight f3. This is important, because if white plays this position with the 2 knights variation, you can't go the same direction. It's a common mistake. So you go here. I'm sorry, yeah, you go here. Yeah, this is the Tartakover setup, exactly. White goes here, white goes here, and you're thinking, oh, why is it going to go d4, e6, or knight e7? We just transpose, right? No. White plays knight e5 immediately. Whoa! Queen h5. Queen d5, bishop c4. Lights out immediately. So only move here not to lose is g6. Look at this bishop. Queen f3, another attack. Resign. That's it. The game's over immediately. You can't do it. So you play queen e5, hitting the queen and the knight. Queen b7, bishop e2. The rook is lost. Black can resign. That's it. That's simple. So there's some tricks in this position, but black cannot go to the same setup with bishop f5 and bishop g6. But we are going to play the Tartakover. And again, I mean, white has to play queen e2 here, because now look at this. This entire knight f6 is not dangerous, because if he already learned something with this d4 setup, do you remember we had exactly the same position with d4, but the knight was here. And what did I tell you? White's best setup is d4, c3, bishop d3, and knight e2. Why? Because the knight on e2 operates better than on f3. The knight on f3 is pretty bad. You see, it's doing nothing here. And also, after d4, you can't trade the bishop with bishop f4. That's the idea. And black instantly gets an easy game with just exact the same plans. There's nothing difficult about this. You play bishop d6, so white goes here, you go here, you go here. Again, you can come up with the same concept, same ideas. For example, you play rook e8. The only nuance here maybe is I would not rush with a bishop g4, bishop h5, because your opponent doesn't cast a short, and you have to be a bit careful not to run into a very common idea, h4. Yeah, this is something you always remember. I mean, if you have the pawn on g6, either by h takes on g6 or playing g6 yourself, and white has no castle short, he will have the h4, h5 idea, right? I mean, he wants to open up the king side, he's going to castle long, and you're in trouble. This is not really that difficult to remember. That's why, again, I'm always saying that the most important thing when it comes to the opening theory is you understand the ideas. What needs to be done when. So whenever you are studying the opening theory, move per move per move, like in this position I'm supposed to go there, in that position I'm supposed to go there. It's a bad trend. You're not going to remember. You're always going to mix up. So that's why I'm strongly recommending you always try to remember typical core ideas, maybe which piece can be traded for what piece, and in which direction I'm supposed to play. That's it. So even if you mix up, at least for you, the plans are pretty clear. So that's why here we are not going to play bishop g4. There's rook e8 check here, and even though this is kind of okay, I mean, white can play a gambit, but again, knight e7 is pretty easy, knight f8. You remember this maneuver? I'm pretty sure you do. There's no need to touch these pawns. So let's say white goes ambitious. No, I did not cover the fantasy variation just yet. It's next. Bishop e6. Again, we want to play b5, a5, a4. Black goes here. We play b5. Black, yeah, I don't know. h4, a5, a4, b4, b3. So imagine this, like here, here, here. Maybe you could even include b4, a4. You want to play b3, open up the queen side. So h6, g6. What white is doing here, you know? So let's say he goes somewhere here. You sacrifice the pawn. You play something like queen e7, rook b8, queen b7. Checkmate. Hello, Leo Krank. Sveiki from Latvian American. Hello from Latvian. So, by the way, sacrificing this pawn to open up the queen side is such a natural thing to do. So don't be put back by something like that. Yeah, so you have plenty of piece activity here. This pawn doesn't matter. The white king is in danger. So you're just thinking about ways to open up the queen side. That's it. And let's say your opponent doesn't do that. He plays something like c4. Again, you play b5. Very easy pawn sacrifice. So actually here it's not even a sacrifice because takes, bishop b5 is going to be rook c8. But even if this was not possible, you are just happy to play a rook e7. Even this position, you're so happy. Look at this. It's just so bad, right? I mean, you have so strong pieces here. White has the extra pawn, but you have all the fun. So think about like queen a5, b3, bishop b3, goodbye. That's it. White is toast immediately. So all it took us was just one pawn to completely demolish white's defenses. You secure your king side and you play at a queen side, the pawn majority. So that's why this knight f3 is just, with knight f6, my apologies, is just not good. And again, it just proves that the Tartakova system with e takes on f6 is giving black super solid setup. So that's why white plays here queen e2. And after queen e2, you have to be a bit careful. Because if you want to look silly, you can play knight e7. And the game finishes immediately. I'm pretty sure in the history of chess, there's at least dozens of players who have blundered a mate like this. So remember it. It's not really that difficult. Obviously, you can't take it, the king is pinned, you see. So we have to do something here. And now the simplest continuation you can do is you take on e4, and now you have a choice. I believe this is the simplest continuation, queen d5, immediately giving you a fine game. There is a more complex continuation, knight e7. Unfortunately, we cannot play g6 and bishop g7, which would be fantastic, because white plays queen d5 and white ruins our coordination. So even if we play rook g8 and bishop g7, you see we can never castle short. And f6 is obviously not in the cards, because we just weaken the king for no good reason. I think it was Ben Feingold who once said that you never ever push forward your king side f pawn to either f3 or f6. So definitely he's right about it. I mean, there's sometimes exceptions, of course, but if you can avoid doing it, avoid it. But there's this more complex continuation with knight e7. You want to play knight f6, replace the knight, since now there's no knight e6 checkmate threatening. And now it leads to a bit complex game, because white plays this very spectacular knight e5. Obviously, you can take on e4, that's a checkmate on the board. So you have to play e6. Now what I slightly don't like about this position is that you do not get out your bishop. So white goes here. There's some tricks with b5. This is quite a fancy theory. White cannot take on c6 because these complications work in favor for black, like a6, bishop d7, and white just loses the knight on c6 eventually. All of this is not really so important because nobody with white normally falls for this line. And now the strongest continuation is bishop d3, which I believe serves black some problems because a4 is incoming. And black is worse. At least I think so. Maybe somebody is going to disagree with me and say that after queen c7 everything is okay. But yeah, this line, a4, bishop d6, knight c6, short castle. You have to like play a really inspired game. But at the end of this, white still keeps the better position. So that's the reason why I don't like this. And I think this queen d5 just gives immediately black a good position, because if white trades the queens, you instantly get a very good Gospel structure, get out the bishop, play e6. And one thing I think we're going to talk about a bit in the pawn structure, or maybe in the exchange Caro-Kann chapter, because I'm also going to talk about exchange Caro-Kann, is that I'm a strong believer of the pawn structure as it gives you directions. So you see, if we play e6, our pawns on f7, e6, and d5, they form sort of an arrow that shows you that you have to play at a queen side. And this means you're going to play rook b8, b5, b4, try to generate weaknesses on c3. But we're going to talk about it a bit later. So naturally, white has to do something here. And there's two continuations that really matter. Everything else is kind of worse. So, yeah, white could play bishop d3, doesn't matter, trade it, play bishop e6 or even g6. It doesn't matter, you're just getting an equal position. White could play either queen f4 or queen h4. Now, what you want to do, you want to find a way to trade the queens. Because now the main problem here is white wants to play bishop c4 and ask you some questions here with a pawn on f7. So you play queen e6 and you trade the queens. That's it. There's also this more sharp move, queen g6. I'm not sure I like it. You hit the pawn on g2, hit the pawn on c2. Here you take the pawn on c2 and then you suffer. I mean, if you have nothing better to do, you can always go here. All you need to know is that Stockfish here fully endorses white's position. You are underdeveloped, you have an extra pawn, but your position is very dangerous. That's all you need to know. But that's why here the simplest move is queen g4. You trade off the queens. The queen has nowhere to go. Queen g3 is the best move for white. I now play g6 and that's it. Oh, there's a trap to avoid. That's nice. Yeah, thank you for mentioning this. Yes, fair point. Queen f4, bishop f5, bishop e4. Here, takes, bishop f7. Thank you. Claudia Maker. Knight g5 and white wins. Yes, fair point. So, we're going to talk about queen f4. But again, queen h4, you play queen e6, you trade the queens. You trade and play g6. Again, this position is super easy. bishop g7, castles, and then think about where to develop your kingside pieces. Maybe even c5, knight c6 could be a thing. Maybe bishop f5, knight e7. You have a lot of freedom. You're completely okay. So that's why white tries to play queen f4 with the threat of bishop c4. Now again, you play queen f5, you trade queens, and you also hit the pawn on c2 in some lines. So it seems that white has to play queen e3 because, again, d3 is not very dangerous. You just trade the queens, you play knight e7, again g6, bishop g7, castles, and you might already remember these ideas, a5. Everything is the same, right? a5, a4, maybe at some point b5, knight b6, knight e5. So d4, knight b6, a4, a3, bishop e6. Pretty simple idea. Protect the pawn on e8, on e7 by rook e8, bishop d5, knight c4, b5. You have beautiful outposts on a d5 on c4, and then in the endgame outplay your opponent. So it also doesn't give white any advantage, and white probably has to do this. Now, queen e3 is slightly worse for black. Queen e6, my apologies. You can still do it, but it's not great because white is going to take with f-pawn, and you're slightly worse in those positions. But now you can play... Oh, sorry. Yeah, now you can play knight e7. Not a very difficult move. So, let's say c3, d4, knight e5, and you already know this maneuver. Since you are not interested to play e6, bishop e7 because it blocks your bishop, you're playing g6. And I think in general, whenever you can position the bishop on g7 to open up this long diagonal for the bishop, it makes perfect sense to do it. And now you're, again, just having a very dynamic position. You're thinking about moves like bishop g4, like c5. So your idea is to play c5, queen c5, get the pawn majority in the center. And here Stockfish kind of evaluates the position slightly in favor of white, but I think it's just completely okay for black. I don't really see any weaknesses for black, so seems to be good. Maybe also you can play the same idea, a5, b5, secure the knight, so these ideas again repeat all over again. Doesn't the Doxwell bishop look silly looking at a pawn? That's why I'm saying you want to play c5. Also, by positioning the bishop on g7, you're stopping white's c4 idea, because now this bishop is seriously looking at a pawn. And one thing I think it's very important also for you to understand is that white might be having trouble to understand where his pawn play lies. Meaning, when we talk about pretty advanced chess, I'm a strong believer that you are generating targets in your opponent's position by using your pawns. You use your pawns, push them forward to generate targets. But when you look at this position, how exactly white is going to use the pawn play? How? Where's the pawn push? So you're going to play queen c2, bishop g5. You're going to play queen c2, b... What? Right? What do you want to do, right? It's not really so simple, because for black, the pawn play is very obvious. You want to play c5. Or you want to play a5, b5, a4, b4. Your plan is obvious. You're much more flexible. For white, it's not so much. So it's got to be some c4. But again, now the pawn on d4 becomes a problem. Yeah, so it's a bit a longer idea. But again, Stockfish disagrees and says that white is slightly better. So I'm not going to argue with that. Right. So this entire system, queen e5 instantly gives black a simple position. Again, you remember the principle. You want to trade the queens. You remember the principle. You want to play g6 on bishop g7. Watch out for some queen e5 idea, for example. Again, don't mix up g6. It's queen e5. There's nothing to know here. That's why, I mean, this entire setup is so easy, right? I mean, the two knights variation, you take on e4, you play knight f6. So, okay, maybe there's this this knight g5. I didn't really check it, this knight g5. Maybe I should have. Just a second, let me check it. I don't think it works because you play h6. Is this really this alien gambit? I don't think it works. Like knight f7, king f7, knight e5. A piece is a piece, right? King g8, bishop c4, e6. I think it's a bit too much, but I think I'm gonna update my PGN for this sacrifice. Make sure it does work. So you just calmly develop, bring out the pieces, and don't fall for some cheap tricks, right? So I don't think it's supposed to work. Like even maybe this is a bit better version. Like where was this? D4, D5, knight C3, takes, knight F6, knight G5, and again I think just H6, right? So just a sec, let me check if this was the position. I do not remember this. Yeah, just H6, knight F7, king F7. Let me check. Probably some knight F3. It's exactly the same, right? Don't fall for some tricks. I'm pretty sure you can play E6 and king G8. But okay, I'm gonna update the PGN. I mean, maybe this works in a bullet, but it's not gonna work in like a rapid game or a classical game. All you need to know, Stockfish says, white is in deep trouble. That's it. That's all you need to know. A piece is a piece. But okay, I'm gonna update the PGN. I understand it's, of course, it's fun. When you're playing an online bullet, it's fun. But like when you're playing pretty good chess, no, I don't think it's very good. All right, so we're talking about the two knights variation. Let me think if I covered everything here. Yeah, again, knight f6. There was also this line if white plays something like knight g3. Oh, sorry. Hey, Sledgehammer. There's also this line if white plays knight g3. Again, I think you have a lot of freedom. You can play g6, bishop g7. Same idea. The knight on g3 is bad. You know what? What I wouldn't do if you want to play Caro, I wouldn't blindly follow an idea that you kind of know from a different variation. Like, you think, I have to play bishop g4. Who said that? You don't have to play bishop g4. That's why, again, whenever you're studying opening theory here, after basically in our setup that I'm proposing, you don't have to play bishop g4 like anywhere at all. I don't even remember. Where do you have to play bishop g4? All you're looking for is give your pieces active squares. And if your knight retreats, very often it's just g6 and bishop g7, and keep the bishop here on c8 for the time being. There was also another move. After knight f6, knight g3, there are moments where you can play c5 immediately. Yeah, you can do that. c5, knight c6, again g6, bishop g7. Claudio Maker says h5 is thematic here. Maybe. Yeah, it's more or less the same. You are threatening to play h4. Your opponent responds here. You probably play something like g6 and bishop g7. I'm not really sure what's the big difference. But yeah, it's a playable idea. You want to bother the knight? Why not? Yeah, maybe actually the difference here after h4 you play bishop g4. Why doesn't have h3? Okay, that's actually interesting. You can do that. Yeah, you can do that. And maybe now play the classical Caro with e6. Right. But okay, I mean, nobody plays knight g3. Nobody. Because everybody plays here either knight f6 or queen e2. That's it. Let's move on with the opening theory. We have more setups to check. We have the fantasy variation. So what is the fantasy variation? It is e4, c6, d4, d5. We're going back to the e4, d4 setup, f3. So why the fantasy variation is so popular? Because it feels different compared to Caro. So many players from the white's perspective, they're pretty annoyed with the Caro-Kann. It's so solid, it's so tough to crack. So they're playing the fantasy variation. And the idea for white wants to play bishop e3, knight c3, queen e2 long castle. Really simple. Now, I'm about to propose here you a very simple setup, and you basically need to know nothing. You're going to see why. Obviously, there's more than one good combinations. But let me start with what does white want. Now, if you have seen something from the fantasy variation, you want to play d takes, f takes, e5. Yes, it feels so great. Because if your opponent takes on e5, you play queen h4, you play queen e4, and white just loses. But actually, every single player who plays the fantasy variation, they know this line. And that's why white plays knight f3. And let's say if you don't know this, white plays bishop c4. And this line is incredibly dangerous for black. Do not go here. If you already got here, you have to navigate very carefully the next moves not to lose on the spot. For example, you go here, and you're just losing. Just like that. Knight g5, bishop f7. Wait, I'm getting two minor pieces for the rook, right? No. Goodbye. Any questions? It was really that simple. So queen h5, obviously you could take the queen on h5, that's a pin. It's just one line. Yeah, but there's more. There's more lines. You don't want to go here. This is a very bad line. So my recommendation would be do not go for sharp lines that you do not know perfectly. I mean, there is some tricks. Yes, there's tricks like bishop e6. You can play this line. It's actually a pretty fun line. Now the point after bishop e6, this is not a line that many people know. The point is after knight e5 you play queen h4, and after d takes on e5 you play knight e7, queen a5, you get the pawn on e5 back with a great position. But there are nuances. It's a very sharp game while I play c3, etc. So you need to know stuff. So if you don't know it, don't go here. There's also the move e5, which has interesting reputation. Like d takes on e5, there's queen b6, or was it queen b6 immediately? Maybe it was queen b6 immediately with some bishop c5 ideas and etc. But white is doing okay. All you need to know is the move e6. That's it. That's it. That's it. So you play e6. Your threat is you want to take on e4 and play queen h4 check. That's it. That's all you need to know. You want to win this pawn. So if white plays something you've never seen before, white plays c4, you take on e4. It's really that easy. You take on e4, you play queen h4, everything is good. If white plays some sort of a gambit with knight c3, just take the pawn. Just take the pawn, you play knight f6, play c5. I mean, white has to work really hard to prove whatever white has for the compensation. It's really that basic. And the same applies for bishop e3. Again, you take on e4, queen h4, queen e4, take the pawn. Not difficult. So now it really matters what white does. So white typically plays something like knight c3. So knight c3, obviously the d takes, f takes, queen h4 doesn't work. But guess what? We renew the threat. We play bishop e4. How difficult can it be, right? So again, you want to take on e4, play queen h4, collect a pawn. That simple. Now, obviously, white has some choices. White has a million moves. For example, if white plays a gambit, you're like, fine, I'm taking the pawn. You prove it. You prove it, right? What do you have? Let's say queen e2, c5 is the typical move, but probably you could even take it and play c5 and knight c6. You always play c5 to generate some counterplay. White could play bishop f4. Yeah, bishop f4 is a move. Now queen h4 no longer works. And now comes in the next idea you need to know. If this happens, and you couldn't take the pawn on e4, you want to play knight e7. The knight belongs on e7, and play b6, bishop a6 to solve the problem of your light square bishop. That's it. You have already a full continuation in this line. So let's say knight e7, queen e3, b6, bishop a6, Show castle 97. How difficult can it be? You're instantly getting a good position. So white could also play, I don't know, 92. You play 97. White could go here. Yeah, maybe the trick here is knowing that if you don't ruin your opponent's pawn structure, you do not take on c3. Yeah, you can just retreat. Play 97. Yeah, this is maybe the most complex line with f5, where you get a lot of activity here. The bishop could go back to c7, and now you don't get the bishop out on a6. But normally, like 90% of the continuations, your response is you want to take on e4 and play queen h4, and if it doesn't work, like after knight c3, bishop b4, you want to play knight e7, b6, bishop a6. That's it. So the knight goes to d7. Sometimes you play a5, the Dutch setup. That's it. There was a question, what about queen b6 early? You know, you have many continuations here. You have queen b6. You have e5. You have a d takes on e4, e5. I'm not arguing about queen b6. What I'm saying is that it makes sense for you to choose continuations that are really easy to remember. It's like, I'm going to make this comparison. Like the Evans Gambit. Do you know what 9 professionals out of 10, they're going to tell you how much do you need to know about the Evans Gambit? 9 professionals out of 10, they're going to tell you exactly the same answer. All you need to know about the Evans Gambit is 2 moves. Bishop e7, knight a5. That's it. You don't need to know nothing. I mean, somebody could step in and say, yeah, but what about bishop a5, d4, d6, queen d7? What about this stuff? You know, I'm not arguing about it. Fine, you want to study it, you study it. It's perfect. But I think in the situation where you have to remember so many lines and we just do not remember them, you're always looking for simple continuations that are easy to remember. That's why here nobody even is bothering to check anything else. Everybody knows knight a5 is good. You give up the pawn on e5, you're instantly doing great. That's it. Get me out of here. There's no queen a4, there's c6. White wins back the pawn on e5, you play knight f6, you're doing great. There's like basically one setup you have to know, and black is like completely fine. That's why the same applies for the fantasy variation. I mean, you can play queen b6, you can play d takes, f takes, e5, bishop e6, etc. You can purchase full chessable courses and study all of this, but why bother when you can just play one simple setup? e6, bishop e4, knight e7. Again, if anybody plays e5 or queen b6, I'm sure you like it. It's great, right? But I'm just telling the simple way to play out this position. All right, that's it about the fantasy variation. I mean, I don't see any other discussion that we need to do it here. What do I play for white here? This is not the topic of this bootcamp. So I'm not covering the fantasy variation from the white's perspective. That's why we're not going to talk about it. Let's move on. And maybe now I'm going to start before we are talking about the... why knight e7? Yeah, that was this question. Why knight e7? Because the knight stands well on e7. If you play knight f6, the problem is you're jumping under tempies. You're jumping under e5. And you're basically playing some sort of a French defense, where the knight on d7, by the way, the knight on d7 in the French defense is not always so great. So now you have to play like b6 and bishop a6. The knight is pretty silly here. And white can start to attack you with a Kingston attack with queen g4. So if you play knight e7, this is not happening. So e5 now feels super slow. f4, e5, queen g4. I mean, f4 you can already take on e4. That's why. You're playing knight e7 to be more resilient against white's center attack. And you are focusing on b6 and bishop a6. All right, let's move on. And before we move on to advanced variation, now we're going to check the sidelines. some other lines that have been popular at a certain moment. So, oh, sorry. E4, C6. So we're going to start with D3. Now, D3 is something that used to be quite popular. The point of this D392 is there's so many fans out there of the King's Indian attack, including myself. I mean, I love the setup. G3, bishop G2, knight F3, show castle, E5 there. You just do the same stuff over again. It's very simple setup. However, there has been a flaw found in the setup. The flaw is E5. So if black plays something else like knight F6, G6, bishop G7, white instantly gets what he wants. Yes, I made a course, yes. So E5 is the problem. That's why knight E2 no longer is popular, because of this move. So white goes here, bishop D6. Now G3, I mean, you can do it, but black already is so great here, like here, here, here. The worst case, we can just go here. I mean, black is like completely okay. So, okay, I mean, so is white, but I mean, black has no issues here. That's why after bishop D6, white was testing the idea with D4. And now, this is a pretty forcing line. Takes, takes, C takes on D5. We get an isolated pawn. And again, this is something where the understanding of this setup has dramatically changed. Because if you would look at some older books, maybe printed, I don't know, 70s or 80s, an author is going to say, oh, white is so much better here. Why? Because you have an isolated pawn on D5, it's blocked by the knight on D4, so black is much worse. Trust me. There are texts like this in all books. But nowadays, the modern understanding of this position is that the isolated pawn means nothing. Black is having a healthy development. And very often I talk about the things that are important in chess, like this Maslow's pyramid. I think I'm going to rename it at some point Neiksans pyramid, because I keep referring to Maslow and there's no Maslow here. So it's just me. So what is important in chess? At the very top of this pyramid is initiative, is space advantage, strong center, obviously well-positioned pieces. What is at the very bottom? Everything pawn related. Isolated pawns, double pawns, weak pawns, losing pawns, whatever. All kinds of pawns. It does not matter. So if you get over the fear of having a weak pawn, or having an isolated pawn, or double pawn, or whatever, and you're going to focus on what's important in chess, like the initiative, you're making a major step. Trust me. So that's why here also the understanding of, yes, the king's safety, of course, is at the very top. Thank you, Lemmings player. That's why the understanding of this position has massively changed. And if you are curious what Stockfish says about this position, black is better. Can you believe it? Black is better. He has a weak pawn on D5, white has the perfect outpost on D4, and yet Stockfish says black is better. Why? Because we have the better pieces. We have the center. I mean, do not underestimate an isolated pawn on D5. It's the only central pawn on the board. It's not a weakness. So that's why here it's a very easy game for black. I just show you some like sample line. Obviously, there's more lines. I mean, you could even afford to play like rook e8, g5, and knight e4. Aggressively push for the kingside pawns. Just use your piece activity and ask Stockfish what it thinks about this position. So the queen goes to f6, and the pawn on d5 doesn't matter, because the best part about weak pawns is you can sacrifice them. At any given moment, you don't have to protect them at all costs. If you have this understanding, you're definitely going to become a better player. So, This is the reason. This is the reason why e5 has basically killed this system. I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating, guys. You can still play it with white, but black instantly gets a fine game. And this is where it comes into play the trendy move, knight f3. And now you understand why this is so trendy. Or we could actually do also with, we could do this move order, knight f3, d5, d3. It doesn't matter. Same move order. Why this is a much better version for white. Oh, sorry. D3, d5, and knight f3. Because white stops the e5 idea. That's it. So basically what white says, I don't mind going to an endgame. Like takes, 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 bishop g4. There's some other lines, I'm just showing a sample line. Bishop e2, knight e7, typical move. Knight e5 in this position. Takes, takes, knight f6, f3. White is better. White is simply better because white has the center, white has a beautiful king, white's going to play moves like knight e3, a4, a5. Trust me, I have played this literally dozens of times from the white's perspective in all kinds of move order. This move, d3, is the trendy setup right now against the Caro. Because white is happy with a queen trade, and you can't easily play e5. And on top of that, white still wants to play the king's Indian attack. That's what it makes so great. So let's say you are like thinking, oh, what's the big deal? I'm going to play here. Knight e2. And with this move order, white tricked you. I mean, you can still play e5 here, but this is not the same. Your position is not ideal. By the way, this is in my king's Indian attack course for Chessable. This is not the same. And that's why here, if black understands that the core idea is to play queen c7 to play e5, he's good. Hey, Andros Lord, appreciate the sub. Thank you. So the best move is queen c7. Now, after queen c7 is our idea is to play e5. Again, thank you, Vascar. Appreciate it. So again, we want to play e5. And you see, this is my favorite way to learn things, to also to teach things to other people, is that you are focusing on ideas. You are not focusing on, oh, against this move, I have to do that move. Thank you, Muddy Waters, for the sub as well. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. But you have to understand what both sides are trying to achieve. If you do not understand what both sides are trying to achieve, you are in the dark. Because if something happens, there's a sidestep, you will have difficulties to improvise. And improvising is a very big part of chess. So it's very important to understand the idea. So again, like I already told you, white wants to trick you. White wants to get to knight e2, g3, bishop g2, while not giving you the idea to play e5. But that's why we play queen c7. We insist on e5. And if white plays g3, take e5. Mission accomplished. Black is fine. Again, white can play this. No problem. But neither has black any problems. So that's why here, the main move in this position is knight c3. And this is something I played myself a lot. I mean, white immediately exploits the weakening of the pawn on d5. So our only move basically is to take, because if we play something like knight f6, we jump under e5. e5 and d4. We already know this is bad from several setups. It's just bad. White has space advantage. Is e takes, d takes, c4 interesting for white? Thank you, Duck's Paradise. It is. This is a completely different setup. I did not include it. It's not going to be in the PGN. It is simply transposing to a completely different position. Yeah, you can do it. Like black plays knight f6, e6, and has a decent position. I've been thinking about playing this from the white's perspective because it feels that c4 is one of the principal choices. But obviously, I'm not going to do it here. Otherwise, I'm just giving you a full chessable course for free. Yes, c4 is definitely a move. But most people don't play it. They don't play it. They don't know it. And most people, they play knight c3. Again, we take on e4. We have to. We have no choice. And if white plays d takes on e4, we play e5. Mission accomplished. We're doing okay. So white has to take with the knight. And now you cannot play e5. You cannot do it. Because white plays d4, you're way behind in development. Please do not do this. Like this. This is suicide. So this counterattack, it looks like awfully like Latvian Gambit. Did not do it. Yeah, this is really bad. You can't play e5 because you are underdeveloped. So you are still playing knight f6. And guess what? Tartakover. Again, Tartakover. If you master the Tartakover setup, you're going to get a lot of easy points. So if white goes, white goes queen e2. If white goes knight f6, e takes at f6, white goes whatever, I don't know. Use your imagination. So g3, bishop d6, bishop g2, castles. How difficult can it be to play this position? Again, maybe a5 at some point against space, rook e1, knight a6, bishop e6, rook e8, b5. Come on, guys. It's the same. So you're just executing the same idea all over again. Yeah, it's just super easy to play, and white's this extra pawn that white has at the queens, it doesn't matter. So again, Tartakover system, if you master it, you're set. Against the two knights in this line, in the main variation, it's so easy to learn. Thank you, numero uno, for the sub. Appreciate it. So that's why the main move is queen e2. Why? Because we want to take on e4, we want to play e5. If I play something else, we take on e4, we play e5. Not difficult, right? So we already know. White plays a3, white plays b3, we take on e4, we play e5. That's very easy. So white plays queen e2 to recapture on e4 with the queen. Now you can play knight e7 if you want. It's completely fine, but I think this is a bit easier move. So knight e4, queen e4. We play knight e7. White goes here, hits the queen. We play queen b6. Long castle. This is a very forcing line. Knight f6. White goes queen e1. And now you have a choice. Actually, here you have a choice. So you could play the automatic bishop g4 and play e6 and bishop e7. You could do it. It's completely fine. But if you have been carefully following this bootcamp, you're going to remember my words that I told you. There's no such thing in the Caro as a mandatory bishop g4. I told you this. Why? Because this position is going to by force lead you to a setup where you're lacking two bishops. Like e6, white's going to go here. Probably you're still okay, but by definition, these positions are almost always slightly better for white. I have played my fair share of classical games here, so I know what I'm talking about. So, that's why here you can improvise, and I think that g6 is very much in the character of the position. We give this bishop along the diagonal, and it makes perfect sense. The queen on b6 is positioned perfectly for this occasion. So, white could go here. We put the knight on d5. Bishop e5 f6 feels to be trouble. The bishop goes back. This queen, I'm not really sure. I think you can start even with bishop g7. I just throw down this move so that you have access to b5. But yeah, it doesn't really matter. This move order doesn't matter. So you play a5, you play b5, you play short castle. Maybe actually delay the short castle here so that h4, h5 doesn't become a problem. So let's say white goes here. You can play bishop g4, stopping h5, or you could even play h6. If white goes c4, now look at this bishop. It's becoming a monster. So you could remove the knight, maybe kill the knight on f3 and hit the pawn on d4 with everything you can, like knight b4. But if white doesn't do it, you play b5. b5, put the bishop on e6, and you're thinking about a queenside attack. How difficult is this? It's, again, very simple setup. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's more theory, but I think that this g6 and bishop g7 is a very important choice. All right, so let me check if I missed any sidelines. Yeah, there is a sideline that starts obviously with d4, d5. There's two more. Yes, there's two more. Wait, where did I leave this? Actually, I had written it down. Just a second. d4, c6, d4, d5. Takes. Wait, on which line did I left it? Thank you, Rasola TV. Appreciate it. So there's two more setups, but I lost the variation. Where did I leave it? Wait, did I leave it here? Just a second. d4, d5. I wanted to talk about the Panov. Yes, the Panov. But where did I leave it? e4, c6, d4, d5. Yeah, the Panov is here, but I don't know where it is because it's in the PGN, but for some reason it has not loaded. Anyway, I'll try to remember. So a big setup is e takes and c takes. Now the Panov system is pretty annoying. Why is this? Because it very often can lead to a very forcing endgame. So let's say white goes c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, and knight f3. The point is, I think literally every single player who is playing the Panov, they know this line. They know bishop g4. You want to take on f3 and take on d4. So white has to include c takes on d5. By the way, this is sometimes a mix-up. Queen b3 is a big mistake. This is a big mistake. Now you take on f3 and knight d4 is a problem. People sometimes mix up this setup. So white has to include c takes, knight e5. You want to play e6 as quickly as possible. So white plays queen b3, hits the knight, hits the pawn. Super forcing line. Bishop f3, g takes on f3, knight. Wait, what was the line here? Yeah, sorry, e6, you protect the knight, queen b7, knight e4, bishop b5, knight b5. Now this super annoying intermezzo check, queen c6 check. You can't play queen d7, the rook is under attack. You have to go king e7, don't be scared, this is theory. Queen b5, queen d7. Obviously there's some sidelines, but takes, and blah, blah, blah. So the opening theory only develops here. And I remember I had once a discussion with my very good friend, Igor Kovalenko, the Ukrainian grandmaster. He was playing for Latvian team for about 10 years before he switched back to Ukraine. And we had a discussion about this. And I said, if somebody is playing this position for a win, it's only white. Because white's going to play like bishop e3, put a king on e2, white has a chance to organize an outside pass pawn, and yeah, you have difficulties to play. And he said, no, I disagree. I think that black can actually take over the game because in some endgames the rook goes here to h-file. You know what? If you feel happy, you can go for this line, especially if you're making your first steps. But the thing is, everybody knows this line. So that's why I think it's a good idea to sidestep a bit early. And yeah, there's this queen c5 idea indeed. Yes, Claudia Maker. But now you're looking for something else. So every single move, every other move you're going to make, it's going to be slightly feeling like a concession. So I think that pretty worthy alternative for you is to play g6. And now you want to play bishop g7 and shoot castle and at some point take on c4 and hit the pawn on d4. And again, this leads to pretty forcing lines. So white has basically two moves here. I think one of them is a bit annoying. So white could play bishop g5, which is not dangerous. At least I think so. You play bishop e6, take on f6, e takes on f6. This accepting the pawn on d5 is not dangerous. Guess what? Because it's the Tartakova again. Same setup again. So if we already have mastered the Tartakova, we have no problem to play on this position. The pawn on d4 is going to be a problem. So white plays c5, black plays bishop g7. Actually, this is a pretty great line. This is a great line for black. There's very good chance that black overtakes the game. But the problem is, isn't a6 also good? Yeah, I didn't check it really so deeply. Here, yeah, Claudio Maker is suggesting a6. I think what I'm slightly concerned about is the c5 idea in general. c5, you can definitely play it. Yeah, c5, bring out the bishop and then play e6. Like bishop g4, e6. You can do it. Yeah, by the way, I didn't include this. I didn't include this in the PGN, but you can do it. Yeah, you can play a6 to stop this queen b3 idea. Because now in some lines you're going to have access to knight a5. Yeah, now queen b3 is quite ridiculous. You see, with this pawn on a6, we can play knight a5, queen a4, and bishop d7. And also, yeah, as rightfully Muddy Waters, I think it was, who said it, you can do this. And now there's this trick with bishop e6. Yeah, this is a fair point. Because this is a pretty nice trick with queen b7 to trap the queen with knight a5. You see, this queen has nowhere to go. I forgot about this a6. So thank you for reminding me this. Yeah, maybe I'm going to include it still in the PGN as an extra line. But I thought you can always play g6. And now this is a forcing line after c takes on d5, knight e5. White plays either queen b3 or bishop c4 immediately. I don't think it really matters. And very often these lines lead to some kind of a repetition, like knight c3. You want to play bishop g7 and castle. White is pretty annoying. White includes bishop c4. Now the thing is, you really have to know your opponent. How well do you know him? Does he want to play for a draw or not? Because if you play bishop g7, if white is annoying, he can repeat the position with bishop a3, bishop f8, bishop c1, bishop e7, bishop h6, bishop f8, bishop c1. That's a problem of this line. Right. So the thing is, if you suspect that your opponent is playing for a draw and you're already here, you can probably just accept a slightly worse position. Just play e6. And play this position. So your opponent still has to work pretty hard to prove the advantage. So let's say bishop b5, bishop g7, takes, castles. I mean, it's slightly worse, but maybe it's not a big deal. Against somebody who is desperately trying to make a draw against you. But actually, it's a fair point, you know? I'm going to update my PGM with a move a6. So again, directed against queen b3. That's why we have the greatest members here. Very qualified chat. And yeah, after c5, bishop g4, e6, and play this position. Okay. But the good side about the Panov is that it has not so difficult, not so long lines. And even here, if you're like completely running out of ideas, you can always just play g6 and just give up the pawn and play bishop g7, give up the pawn here, play shoot castle. White's going to hold on to the pawn, but you're having a pretty decent possession. So you want to play knight e7, knight b6, a6, b5 before, so white has to like work very hard to prove the advantage. So this I'm not going to include the PGN. But yeah, Panov has the reputation of being not a dangerous setup, but being pretty annoying. It is not really popular. To be honest, I don't even know who is playing it, but if you're curious about... No, I will not release a course on this. No, Muddy Waters. If you're curious about the reputation, black is completely fine. Maybe this a6 is a trend. I had forgotten about this. But what is the reputation of the e6 line? I think you do not want to go for positions with the classical IQP. IQP meaning white has an isolated pawn on d4 and you are just trying to build a blockade on d5. Why is this? Because I have not seen basically a single IQP classical setup lately from the black's perspective. I think the reason is that it's kind of proven. The reputation is that these positions are dangerous for black. So if you're curious about some of the typical ideas and plans about the IQP, I made a bootcamp about it. So I talked about it. I talked about what are the typical plans for the IQP from the white's perspective, how black is supposed to play against it. That's a separate bootcamp. So this is the reason why this e6 is not really that great. How about bishop g5 in the Panov? Where? You mean after g6? Here? Here, bishop g5? I'm pretty sure you can just go to your classical setups. Ah, wait, there was this line with bishop g7, right? Now I recall. Now, actually, I'm wondering if there's a problem with d-takes on c4. Like, I don't recall any opening theory. I think this is just good, right? You're just playing immediately bishop g7 and castles. But there was also some lines with bishop g7 where you can, again, go for some Tartakover, temporarily sacrifice the pawn on d5 and get a lot of activity. Castles, knight c6, bishop g4, trade the knight, play f5, and get a pawn on d4. So knight f3. Maybe we should be... Actually, you can avoid knight c6 altogether. Maybe there's no need for knight c6 at all. Like after knight c3. Yeah, I think this could be pretty interesting. Avoiding knight c6 at all. Just play g6 and bishop g7. Maybe slightly different setup. But you're talking about knight c6, knight f3, g6, and now bishop. This I already mentioned. There's bishop e6. Maybe for the sake of simplicity, I hadn't really thought about it. You can play g6 immediately. g6, bishop g7. If white goes here, you sacrifice the pawn, c takes on d5, and castles. All right, it's time for us to move on. There's one more line we haven't checked, and that is the advanced variation, the main theory. The main theory, and if you're playing against an ambitious player and your opponent plays e5, there's a fair chance that he has studied some opening theory, because if you check some chessable courses, pretty much a vast majority recommends exactly e5, and the understanding of the opening theory has evolved to the point that the space advantage that e5 move promises is the only real thing for white. So I think what's trendy right now in the Caro is this knight f3 d3 endgame, but I think that black is just fine. And like 95%, everybody else just plays e5. This is also one of the drawbacks of the Caro, because black's opportunities here are really limited. So essentially you can play just two setups. Setup number one is bishop f5. Setup number two is c5. That's it. There's basically nothing else. There's no g6. It's just worse. I mean, you're playing g6, you accept that you're worse. You can play a6, you can play queen b6, you can play whatever, a5, you can play queen c7, but just be ready, you're worse, right? And you're playing a trendy line and you're deliberately going for a worse position. If you're okay with that, fine. Have I covered the Catalan opening before? Yes, it is the most watched bootcamp I have done before. I have it. Yes, it's very, very popular. So, Let's have a look at first bishop f5 and try to understand the idea. Why are we doing this? So before we are playing bishop f5 and saying that this has to be done because I said so, let's try to understand why. So we are playing this to play e6 and play c5. So essentially treat the advanced variation of the Caro like an improved version of the French defense advanced variation. So the French defense advanced variation is e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, which, by the way, nobody plays today. Basically nobody, but it's coming back a bit. So c5, c3, and black is having some problems with the last bishop. So black is typically playing moves like queen b6, knight c6, maybe even queen b6, bishop d7, bring out the bishop, trade the bishop. But the big idea is target opponent on d4. So with the queen on b6 and knight on c6, black is targeting the pawn on d4. Sometimes playing f6 to bring more pieces in the game to have some counterplay against the center. Why this is important? Because I think the Caro advanced variation is kind of similar. Because again, we play bishop f5. Our idea is to play e6, play c5, play knight c6, in most cases, and hit the pawn on d4. Now it really depends what white is going to do against it. Because white has many setups and still 95% play h4 here. But why? So let's start with something else. Let's start with a c4 setup. Why white is doing this? White wants to play knight c3 and be very aggressive to take away from you the idea to play c5. So we play e6. What you need to know about this position is what white wants if you take on c4. Because it feels like, hang on, listen, I have a great outpost on d5. I'm going to play knight e7, knight b6, knight e5, and I'm going to rock and roll, right? Just wait. So white goes knight c3. White doesn't put the knight on f3. White puts the knight on e2. So you put your knight on e7. You're about to occupy the d5 square. Everything is great. So white plays here. You're like, okay, what's the big deal? Knight e5, mission accomplished, right? White goes here. Okay, the bishop is under attack. You have to remove it, right? Oh, f4. Oh, f5. You're in trouble. White is just having a much better position. So think about queen d3, queen g3, bishop c2. You are an easy target. So that's why you do not go here. I mean, this line is playable, but you have to be like super careful. It's still going to be a core idea in a very similar position. For example, if we compare this line with h4, I'm going to explain the reason of h4 a bit later. So we play h5. Now, if white plays c4, we play e6, white plays knight c3. Now we do take on c4. We won't occupy the d5 square, but there's going to be a massive difference. Because after knight e7, white goes the same idea, knight e2, bishop e7. The massive difference is we have this counterattack against the pawn on h4. So white is not in time to play knight g3, f4, f5. That's all you need to know. So basically, white is not in time to execute this idea. White has to play something like g3. I mean, knight g3, bishop g6, the pawn on h4 is always under attack. It gives you enough time. So g3, knight h6, typical development move of the knight, and you're about to play like knight b6, knight e5, you're perfectly okay. So white did not manage to carry out his plan. But let's go back to the move c4, e6, knight c3. So that's why we don't take on b4. We play bishop b4. And we're changing the the character of the position here. So if white plays, there's a couple of moves. White plays a3. We play knight e7, and we are aggressively fighting for the light squares. By the way, this is a pretty hard thing for many players to understand because it feels like you are weakening a lot of dark squares in the process. But there's basically no other way. So black plays c5, knight c6, and for example, white plays bishop e2. We play c5, we play knight c6, and black is dynamic enough to have a good game. So this is like a sideline, and in the pigeon I will have more lines. But for example, white goes something like queen b3, which probably feels like an accurate move. We play a5, and now the point is after a3, there's this very important move, d takes on c4. Intermezzo move. Now we take on c3, probably queen c3, knight e7, knight b6, and we occupy the d5 square. And the same applies also for b takes on c3. We play b5, a4. That's an idea already recognized from different setups from the Tartu cover. Again, we are going to play knight e7, knight b6, knight e7, and we very nicely control those light squares. So the c4 idea is interesting, but it's not everything. One of the most played moves at the club level is bishop d3. Basically, it's not dangerous. That's all you need to know. Because you can simply carry out your typical plan. You trade the bishop, and you go for the French defense setup. e6, c5. That's it. This is your dream setup. So white could play something like c3. White could play something like c3, knight c6. Think about castles. Maybe keep the tension a bit. Not rush with c takes on d5. Maybe queen b6. Or even this is probably pretty good. Like takes, knight e7, knight f5, bishop e7. Typical counterattack against the pawn on d4. Engines typically give here some small plus to white because of the space advantage, but black is incredibly solid on playing a good French defense position. So I'm not really sure if I would rush in general about the c takes on d4, but yeah, the question is how do you want to develop the kingside pieces, because you play knight e7, you drop the pawn on c5. Which, by the way, looks pretty interesting. Knight e7, d takes on c5, and knight g6. Hitting the pawn on e5, hitting the pawn on c5. So, looks pretty interesting. Alright, so this bishop d3 again is not dangerous. Also, c3, same stuff. Yeah, you play e6, bishop e3. Used to be quite a continuation, but again, black just gets a very good game after queen b6, queen b3, knight e7, and f6. So typically to the French defense, yeah, black gets a very good game here. Let's say f4, g5, g3, takes, and bishop h6. Yeah, so there's a lot of dynamics here from the black's perspective. But I think that you have more than one way to play this out. All of this feels pretty slow. There is an f4 immediately, but again, you're going to carry out the same idea. So you're thinking about moves like c5, knight c6, possibly take it. Typical moves could involve playing h5, knight h6, bishop e7, rook c8, some great French defense with the bishop out on f5. So finally, we're getting to some of the main moves. If white here plays knight c3, yeah, this is where you have to be careful, because now with knight c3, and same applies for h4, white is waiting for you to play e6 because he wants to trap the bishop. So this will be, by the way, a big mistake. g4, f3, you're losing the bishop. This is one of the core ideas of the move h4. And knight c3 is pretty similar. So white is... Oh, sorry. White is planning to play aggressively at the king side. But the current reputation of this line is that black is doing just fine. So you play e6, g4, and knight e2. There's obviously a lot of complex lines, and I think this is the reason why many players like to play it from the white's perspective, because this doesn't feel like you're a classical Caro. So typically, players who are solid, they're playing the Caro defense, and this is just a mess. Because white wants to play knight f4, h4, and bother you. For example, if you are playing something modest like h6, you were worse. Just a second, how you were worse, I'll try to remember. Yeah, I think it was like this, and this, and this. So white is expecting you to play c5, and you can't easily cast a short because white is ready to open up the king side with h4 and g5. So basically you have to play c5, and the game becomes very sharp. So if you have to play c5, basically do it immediately. So do it immediately, you play c5, and one of the common themes of the Caro is to sacrifice the pawn, to play knight c6, to have a counter-attack against the center, and now it's just crazy mess. h4, h5, knight f4, and give up the pawn. Like this. To force white to take on h5. And there's a lot of crazy lines like knight h5, knight c6. Maybe actually it's pretty easy to play from black. I mean, you forget about the pawn on h5. You gave it up so that you force white to take on h5 and lose him a valuable tempo. And then you try to counter-strike against the center. So again, there's a million lines. White could go here. You play bishop c5. Typically, give up the pawn on g7. Like here, here, here. You play aggressively for the center, you take the pawn on e5, and typical moves like queen e5, knight e5 are starting to income, and the game becomes like a mess. So I don't really want to focus on this too much. If you're curious, you can check out my PGN. I have some files here, some variations here. Yeah, so it's a very inspired game. But all you need to know is that Stockfish evaluates this position in favor for black. Also, I do not think that many players today they play. This used to be quite a thing some time ago because this knight c3, knight g2 was played at the highest level, but now Stockfish says the black is like perfectly fine, and you don't see these games basically anymore unless, again, you have an excellent memorization, you remember these crazy lines, and you're just hoping that your opponent is not going to remember. But again, you know, I think it's, again, so easy to play with black, because even if you mess up, like, how difficult can it be? You play c5, you play h5, you give up the pawn on h5, and then you play knight c6, you make it messy. Right? So you play queen c7, think about taking on d4, taking on e5, think about long castle, ripping apart the center with f6, and trying to create chaos. All right. Looks like annoying to deal with black. I think that Rocket Jacket, you have to know some things. But I think it's also important for you to know the reputation of this line, and it's good. It's a good line. That's why many players from the white, they're not even going here at all. And if you know the setup, you can go here. The alternative, the quieter choice, h6, you're kind of worse. You can do it, but you're kind of worse. Yeah, so you start with c5. You're immediately attacking the center. You play h5, bishop h7, play knight c6. The rest you're going to figure out. All right. There's also the quiet move, knight f3. Like I already said, there's literally a million choices here. So I can play knight f3. And now this is a simple positional chess. You play e6. White goes here. And maybe here the thing is that you don't really want to rush with c5. Because the thing is you're not threatening to take on d4. Because if you take on d4, white takes with the knight and the bishop is under attack. And this is a big theory. Very big theory. So white goes bishop e3. You go queen b6. You hit the pawn. White goes... What was the line again? I don't remember. There was a line where white gives up 2 pawns. Maybe not here. Like knight c3, queen b2, etc, etc, etc. Was it here? I really don't remember. So it's a bit dangerous. I think it was even here, this tricky move, queen b1. You can't take on c3, there's bishop d2, queen b7. If you take on b1, white has a lot of dynamics, etc. It's crazy chess, essentially. But for the simplicity, just play knight e7. Typically, the black knight goes to e7. You can secure your bishop against any knight h4 by playing h6, knight e7, and then you're thinking about c5, knight c6, bringing the kingside knight to c6. Because you have problems with this knight. It has no good squares. Because if you play knight e7, knight g6, the bishop might be in trouble. So you might alternatively bring the knight in the game by playing bishop g6, knight e7, knight f5. But then it's jumping under g4. So that's why there's this interesting maneuver. Knight e7, knight e7, h6, bishop h7, c5, knight c6. And or as Gigantobear also says, as knight c8. It's also pretty interesting. And also on top of that, you're aggressively pushing your queenside pawns. Like, let's say you go... Again, the move order might really vary. Like here, 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 knight e7, a4, a5, typical moves like knight c8, bishop e7, put the knight on b6, also is a possible thing. And then eventually you're looking for the f6 break in the center to generate some counterplay. So either you play c5, knight c6 to play against the pawn on d4, or you play f6. And this f6 is a very common theme. So you might remove the bishop to play f6. Some people play g5, knight g6, play f6, and then recapture with a queen, put the bishop on d6, castle long. There's so many ways to improvise. Again, I think if you're like super serious about it, obviously you have to get a course. This is not a course. It's like basically an introduction to the players who are looking for a new opening to play. They're curious, so I think it could be a very good first step for you, like watching this bootcamp and maybe also studying the PGN. But obviously there's more lines. But up to a certain level, like 1500, I'm pretty sure you don't need even more. All right, and finally we have the move h4, which is played at a pretty good level. So again, the idea is that you can't play e6 because white traps the bishop. So you have to play h5. Why? Because h6 line is kind of risky. So, I mean, I checked it. Black can kind of play it after g4, bishop e4 here, and white typically plays e6 to sacrifice a pawn to imprison your pieces. You see, if you play something like f takes on e6, you will have problems to develop the dark for bishop. So white plays bishop d3, trades the bishops, controls all the light squares in your position. So you basically have to give it up anyway to complete your development. It's very dangerous. So the point here after e6, queen d6, this line is kind of playable, but I think it's pretty dangerous. So knight f6, knight f3, bishop h3. I looked at this nonsense. If you have like nothing better to do, of course you can study it, but it's very concrete. And all you need to know is that Stockfish, the engine, always slightly prefers white no matter what you do. So if you're like looking for more variety, you can include h6 if you want, but h5 is the simplest way. So you're stopping this idea at all. And now there's obviously no g4. White typically plays bishop d3. We trade it. And again, remember, e6 is a big positional threat. You can also play e6 immediately. Doesn't maybe matter much, but there's this very trendy line to play b4. I'm not really sure who at that club level is going to do it. Somebody who hasn't studied any courses is probably not going to play b4, but the big idea is that white uses a tempi to play knight e2 and generate some counterplay with rook b1, which again leads to a very sharp game after e6, rook b1, and queen e7. Yeah, it's a very popular idea nowadays, so you somehow play queen d7, try to normalize, and then capitalize on this extra pawn, but white has a plenty of compensation. So if you're not interested to play queen a5, you can just start to play e6. e6, and now your idea is, for example, white does something like this. Now you play queen a5 check. So the big idea is to put the queen on a6. Let's say white goes here, you want to play queen a6, white goes here. You are very happy with this position. You trade the queens, and again, you're playing for c5. You're thinking actually about c4, b5, b4, going for queenside pawn attack. And your opponent doesn't have the typical kingside attack because the queens are gone off the board. So this is a very important maneuver for you to know. You want to get the queens off the board. Yeah, it's a very good French. It's very good French. So of course, don't blunder e6. Indeed, maybe start with e6. There's some nuances. I think white could start with bishop g5 here. If I'm not terribly mistaken, you are playing queen a5. What the queen is? I already don't remember. Queen a5, knight e2, queen a6, and white tries to stop you by playing c4. Walking into a pin, and there's again some theory. Bishop b4, b3, etc. But I think for your very first steps, if you understand what you want to achieve, that you want to trade the bishops, let me maybe show you some ideal scenario. So we're going to start with this move. So this is your ideal scenario. You play c5. No need to castle. You play b5. You are going to play knight b8, knight c6, a5, rook b8, and b4 eventually. And white has nothing to do at the king side. Maybe bishop e7, bring the other rook to b8, b5, b4. Try to generate a weakness on c3 and have a good game. Or the other idea is you can try to attack the pawn on d4, but it's pretty easy to defend. So I think it makes sense to transfer the weight further to white's queen side. And that's why white is probably going to try to keep queens on the board. Again, it's a bigger theory. There's obviously more. There's more moves. Yeah, there's more nuances. But this is one of the core ideas. You want to play typically e6, c5, knight c6, get the queens off the board so that white doesn't have this kingside attack. Basically, that's it. You know, obviously I skipped a lot of parts. So I think it's very challenging to explain everything about Caro in just 2 hours. But I think in a nutshell, I did it. So if you have any questions, now it's the time. I also have some model games about typical maneuvers that are in the PGN. Maybe I'll just show, for example, this game of Ruslan Ponomaryov, who recently played it against Leon Levitch 2 years ago. You can get the PGN via the Patreon, yes, but the video is free. The video is free to anybody. You're watching it right now. There's obviously no cost for the lesson, and it will be available on YouTube as well, free of charge. So the videos always are going to be free. I mean, it's this extra thing as the PGNs because I've been requested at the PGNs many times, and I do think it's a bit extra, right? So if somebody really wants it, like study it a bit more seriously, or maybe actually use my PGN as the basis of their opening knowledge. You can do it. It's up to you. And obviously, there's many ways how you can use the PGNs. You can create your own lessons here on chess.com. You can create all kinds of these playlists. You can use also ChessBase Reader. I believe it's a free software where you can watch, where you can play the PGN files. So there's more than one possibility to do it. What? Yeah. Oh my goodness! I didn't even mention e5, c5. My bad. Oh, my bad. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. So, we'll have to wait with Ponomariov's game. There's still more. All right. Yes, I mean, I also included c5. So the idea of the c5 move is you do it when you become a bit bored with the main line. And I think that the reputation of the c5 line itself is that it's kind of risky if your opponent knows it's coming. That's why, for example, if you're watching how Levy plays, Levy typically plays bishop f5, the main move. But from time to time, he carries out c5, and there's so many tricks within c5. And by the way, I think Levy's knowledge of the Caro is 2600 ELO. I'm not exaggerating. So he's definitely a big expert in this line. So here the point of c5 is we are willing to sacrifice the pawn to play knight c6. Feels like a French defense, except that we have not committed to e6, and we still can get out the bishop. So if white is like completely unaware what's happening, he's going to play something like c3. We play knight c6. We play c takes on d4 to remove this opportunity for white to take on c5 at some point. We play bishop g4, we play 6. This is not really difficult, right? Again, if you know some French defense ideas, that's the target on d4. So you play queen b6, you want to take on f3, you want to take on d4, so white goes here. You can't take it on d4 because now you drop the bishop. Knight e7, just play like a good French. Now b4, knight e4 is going to be thing because the rook on a1 is under attack, and actually for white it's not really easy here to understand what's the next move. So rook b1 is bishop g6, rook a2 maybe, I don't know, rook a2, b4 or something. That kind of makes no sense. So you can just take it and play knight f5. And just get a good game immediately, yeah? So bishop e3, takes, bishop e7, and you're doing fantastic. So these pawns are easy targets for your bishops. For your bishop. But normally, white doesn't play like this. And white chooses, typically, the move d takes on c5. The point of this is that now after e6, white is okay to give up the pawn on c5 to establish an outpost on d4 for the knight. So white still aims for some sort of a French defense position where the pawn on e5 is protected, where there's a knight on d4, the bishop is on d3, and white is thinking about a king set attack with something like queen g4. And that's why there's many moves here in this position. But typically white plays knight f3, you take on c5. Yeah, by the way, b4 is bad. You play here, you take it, and you play b6. So white cannot keep these pawns together. Bishop b4, queen b6, you regain the pawn. This is an outside pass pawn, but that's a weakness. You have a strong center, strong protected pawn. You have very good development. White is just in trouble. Yeah, a3 is a big move, of course. I can play this myself with white. Yeah, I play this with white. a3, bishop c5, and I believe it was either queen g4 or bishop d3. I don't remember. Maybe bishop d3. But black is okay. Black is okay. That's all you need to know. So, yeah, typically white goes here. You take on c5. White goes now a3 or a3, then play knight f3. You play knight e7, so that's a good square for the knight. And yeah, Now I'm trying to remember what was after b4. Don't remember. Was there any b4 here? But typically you want to put your bishop back on e7 so that you can play f6. Yeah, so this is one of the typical core ideas, to play f6 to target the pawn on e5. And recently Levy played a game against one of the guys in New York City Invitational IM Norm tournament. Not the second one, but the first one. Yeah, because the second one, the GM Norm tournament was a disaster. The one where he won the tournament with 8 points out of 9, he had a very nice game. I think I have it included in the PGN. So, yeah, I think this is not included in the PGN, this b4, bishop b6. Obviously, it's the only move. There's also, of course, f6, yeah. But nowadays, a very trendy move is to play knight f3. And you take on d4 and queen d4. This is a very interesting line. There's some fascinating lines here, because what Levy's one opponent played, knight e4, knight c6, this is just not serious, I think. Knight c6, b takes on c6. Black here has so many ways to improvise, like knight h6, knight f5. Levy played himself, I believe, e6 in one of the games. Also f6 because of possibility. So queen c7. This was the game he played against in this terrible New York GM Norm tournament. Who was his opponent? I don't remember. Everything is the same. But this is not dangerous setup because black, like I already said, black has many ways to improvise. So clearly the main move after knight f3 is queen d4, knight c6, queen f4, and this is where theory only starts. But again, in case you are like completely running out of ideas, you could always just play e6. Go for some French defense position. The bishop is not getting out, so there's no need to try to position here on f5 or g4. So try to kill the bishop here. Play knight e7, knight g6, bishop e7. Just have a healthy position. So probably the line where you want to investigate the most in the c5 line is d takes, e6, knight f3, or lines like a3, bishop c5, stuff like queen g4, etc. But again, you have typical moves. Knight e7, if you can get the knight on g6, you do it. You castle short, you play knight c6, and keep an eye on f6 push. f4 and not knight f3 here. I don't know. I mean, you can just probably take it here, knight f3, and I'm pretty sure you can improvise it here. Like put the knight on h6. By the way, this is a typical great square, also in the French defense. Not to put the knight on e7, blocking the bishop's path. You castle short, you're thinking about f6, or maybe even without f6. Knight c6, queen b6. Looks pretty great. White has problems with this diagonal. Wesley still recommends queen g4. Yeah, probably is good. You mean here? Is this here queen g4? Probably a3, then queen g4, no? Yeah. This is what I have played myself with white. a3, queen g4, plays some sort of a French defense. Yeah, and black plays knight e7, sacrifices the pawn. I don't know what Wesley recommends here. Does he take the pawn? Black definitely has a lot of compensation after rook g8 or whatever. Yeah, something like bishop d3, probably something like knight c6, knight f3, maybe knight g6. So I think black is okay. Actually, Engine doesn't like knight g6 here. Engine ignores the pawn and plays something like queen c7, etc. Queen c7, I don't know, queen g3. You want to play f6, maybe bishop d7, long castle, I think. By the way, the PGN is not yet available on Patreon. Guys, I will do it after. I will do it after this bootcamp. Only after this bootcamp. It's still not there. Because I'm making the live stream right now. First the stream. Then I will tomorrow release the video on my Patreon together with the PGN. So the PGN will have more files, but it's not going to be a full course. It's not going to be a full course. It's like an introduction. The first steps. You meant any course I created on Patreon. I have no courses yet on Patreon. I have ideas. I have big ideas how to use Patreon. I just started out. You know, I created it a month ago. So I've been posting some stuff, but obviously there's so many things to do. But I wanted to make us a very special place. The place where I'm sharing good chess content. Like maybe eventually it's going to be courses. Yeah, like courses, definitely the PGNs of my bootcamps and the game analysis. By the way, today I posted on my Patreon my first video log about my current projects, how I am, what's my current status with Levy, what's he doing for his preparation with Pia Croming match, my upcoming chessable course, what project did I just finish. So there's a lot of stuff. And more is coming. I just I need to find the time to do all of this. All right. So in a nutshell, if you are just starting out as a Caro player, all you need to know against advanced variation. If your opponent plays the advanced variation, he's a serious guy. So I think you have to play bishop f5. So my recommendation would be play bishop f5. Try to carry out the typical ideas with e6, c5, or just get a good development with knight e7, knight e7, and do not blunder the bishop. If you are getting way too many games with the advanced variation, and you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm again getting the same setup, then you start to think about the c5 push. And if you feel your knowledge is like not sufficient, and you need like more, get a course. you get a course, right? Because again, I cannot explain the entire Caro setup like in 2 hours. We got a gifted 20 subs by the Art of Lions. Appreciate it. Thank you, man. Haven't had it for a while. That's pretty fantastic. Thank you. I suppose you like the content. Right. Speaking about good stuff, who are the experts? So I'm going to now name you the experts if you're interested to inquire more information about the Caro. Yeah, Gigantobear says Lars Schandorf is an expert. Yeah, I don't know Schandorf's work, but Levy definitely is an expert. I do not know. So Golem Chess, Levy Rosman, yeah. So he's definitely an expert when it comes to the Caro. I have no idea what he talks about it in his Chess League course. What Chess League 2.0 is all about, I have no idea. But he is living and breathing Caro for many, many years. So I would trust his judgment. Then there's a couple of amazing chessable courses, like Lamy's Lifetime Repertoire on Caro-Kann. It was released several years ago. And knowing how seriously Erwin Lamy treats opening theory, totally. I mean, if you're like super, super serious about it and you want to know everything about the Caro, I think it makes sense to choose it. Also, recently I saw Jovanka Houska's course, whatever it was called on Chessable, something... Was it something simple, starting out Caro, whatever was the title, I really don't remember. And I saw there were very good reviews. You could also check it out. Yeah, those courses. But maybe in the beginning you don't need all of this, because very often this is pretty advanced stuff. Maybe for somebody who is thinking to make your very first steps as a Caro player, maybe for you it's enough just by watching this bootcamp. That's it. And you don't need to do anything else. If you're like below 1000, totally. I think at your level, nobody is gonna know more than like the first 5 moves. Nobody's gonna play moves like bishop f5, knight c3, knight d2, g4, knight f4. Oh, come on, chill. It's not gonna happen. So most likely after bishop f5, your opponent is gonna play like bishop d3, trade the bishops, and you're gonna be already cooking right here. That's it. Yeah. So e5 already is a pretty big knowledge for white, and I think that most players you're gonna play against, they're gonna play knight c3. Pretty sure. Maybe some of the players like to play the 2 knights variation, knight c3, knight f3. Already feels pretty advanced. Why don't I like the third move c5? Who said it? I like it. Oh yeah, and also there's the exchange variation. Right, there's also the exchange variation. e4, c6. This was here. e4, c6, d4. I forgot this. There's one simple setup that you need to know. One simple setup. Yeah, this is a pretty annoying plan for white. White wants to go for bishop f4, the typical Cosbert attack at king's side. How do I know this? I mean, I wrote a course on modern chess a couple of years ago. Now, all you need to know is the following setup. Stay with me. Knight f6, g6, bishop f5, trade the bishops, e6, bishop d6, long castle. That's it. That's it. So you don't need nothing else. There are some sidelines, like you stab a knight f6. Your opponent, let's say he plays bishop f4. You play g6. Who cares? Yeah? You play g6. So you want to play bishop g7 in some lines if he is like super smart and tries to stop you from bishop f5. I don't think it's going to happen in your games. So he's going to play like this. You just go here. He's going to trade and castle. You're going to go here. Do not put the bishop on g7. He's going to go here. Put the bishop on d6. He's going to go here. Put the queen on c7. Now play rook g8 on long castle. How difficult is this? You have a contemplate the g file. Put the knight on e4. Play f6. Very easy plan. It actually works better if your opponent plays also h3, which stops bishop g4. We play g6. We play bishop f5. Now this is a weakness. We play e6. We play bishop d6, queen c7 long castle, rook g8, knight e4. How difficult is this? Obviously, engine always gives some advantage to white in most of the lines, but it's really minimal. This is the simplest setup you can always play. This g6, bishop f5, e6, bishop d6. That's it. You don't need to know much. Thoughts on bishop e2? That's very advanced stuff. You're talking about like here, 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 here. Come on. that already... This is quantum physics, basically, yeah? I mean, you can do it, of course, but... I don't know. Play bishop g7, play castles, put the knight on e4, see what things happen. You just get a healthy position. You get a lot of pieces out. You have no weaknesses. If you feel you have nothing to do with the bishop, just trade it on f3, right? By the way, one of the core ideas I have to explain in this position is that very often white is playing against this light square bishop. Like, he plays h3 literally to play against your bishop, so that you cannot bring it on g4 and you cannot bring it on f5. And that's why we are going to insist to play g6 and bishop f5. But if your opponent is like completely oblivious, like he plays knight f3, I mean, you can play g6 and bishop f5 if you want, but now you can just do this and put the bishop on g6 and play e6. And this immediately gives you equal position. Like here, bishop f4, e6, here, bishop d6. Takes, castles. Let's say knight e2, rook goes here, rook e1, rook b8, b5, a5, b4. Typical casted structure. You want to create a weakness on c3 and maybe trade the bishops on g6 at some point, and black immediately has a fine game. If white plays knight e5, ignore the knight. I mean, not here obviously, but at some point. White plays knight e5, you just ignore it. Thank you, the Art of Lines, appreciate it. So, there's that. All right, I think that, what was the Hillbilly variation? Can you please give me the line? I see you, Dormitron, you already asked it before. Panov. Wait, this was the... this was how it was included. It was under c4. e4, c6, it was here. e4, c6, c4. I found it. It's in the PG and under c4. d5 takes here. There you go. Knight f6. We talked about this. But I think you can even ignore it and play g6 and bishop g7. Ignore the pawn on d5. White can take twice on d5. He can't take on twice on d5. So you still ignore it. Play g6, bishop g7 and castle. You can do it. I mean, obviously I see Engine slightly prefers white. Is it good to push b4 without pushing a5? Which line? So Hillbilly variation you're saying is bishop c4? What is this? I've never seen it before. So what's stopping me to play b5? Is there a trick I'm not aware of? Oh, bishop b3. Oh, I don't know this. This feels like an alien variation or something. So d takes on e4 and queen h5. But where's the trick? I just played g6, no? Yeah? The g6, I stop it. Queen e5, knight f6. No, I mean, in the worst case, you give up the pawn on e4, right? I mean, you give it up. Like knight c3, if you're like completely running out of ideas, you can just play maybe knight e7 to gain tempi. He goes wherever, and you just give it up. I mean, don't try to hold on to the pawn. Play bishop g7, knight e4, and castle. They're like completely fine. You know, one thing you have to know when it comes to all kinds of tricky lines, cheap tricks in the opening, they want you to hold on to your material. They play some weird line where, for example, like this Hillbilly, I didn't know it even exists. So bishop c4, d5, bishop b3. What white wants, not only here but in other lines, is that you hold on to your pawn with your dear life. Like, for example, white plays something like knight c3, and white is hoping that you're going to hold on and hold on and hold on to the pawn. But again, remember what I told you, what is important in chess. The pyramid. What is at the very top? Initiative, healthy development, space advantage, strong center, king safety. At the very bottom of this pyramid, what's there? Pawns, weak pawns, double pawns, isolated pawns, extra pawns, etc. All pawns related, they do not matter. And if your opponent is doing some funny stuff, he's like giving you up a pawn and he's playing pretty weird, you can of course hold on to it, but consider just giving it back. I mean, you have it, but focus on your development. By doing this, you will never go wrong. That's it. It's really that simple. So, I mean, technically here, I do not see anything wrong with g6, queen e5, knight f6, knight c3, and just playing knight e7. You're completing development, yeah? Now let him take the pawn. Fine. You don't take on e4, that's a mate, you go here. Let him worry about his. Look at his development here. It's basically non-existent. All right. Now, maybe fire your questions about Caro. Space advantage is at the top, yes. I mean, Lemmings player, you should know. You're a Tata player. Alright, if you have any questions about Caro, the fantasy I already covered. By the way, in case you missed it, it will be available in the video. Don't worry about it. I do not play myself the Caro. I have been thinking incorporating Caro defense in my own career. I have never got around it, but I think eventually I'm gonna get there. I know a lot about it. That's one of the perks of being a coach. You have to know things. So you know a lot of things that you're not playing yourself. And the main reason why I'm not still there yet is the advanced variation. It's a bit annoying, but what can I do? What's the difference between pushing on c4 or taking on d4 in some lines? Darkona is asking, but can you please be more specific? Are you referring to the Black's typical c6, c5? Are you referring to this line? Are you talking about these positions? When to push c4, when to take on d4? Is this what you're talking about? I quite do not understand. I don't understand you. Guys, one of you is talking c4, c5. The other one is talking about c5, c4, c5. Yeah, guys, indeed, give the line. Otherwise, I don't understand it. What you're talking about? Yeah, I mean, I literally show you 100 lines, and now you're saying, what about if I go here or there? Yeah, and I don't get it. Which line are you talking about? Ah, bishop f5, yeah? All right, bishop f5. Let's say knight f3, e6, bishop e2. So what's the question? What would I say are the lines aside from the advance which are practically really good against the Caro-Kann? The two knights. Thank you, Finvar. Really appreciate for the cheer. Thank you. I would say the two knights, if you know how to operate well the two bishop advantage. I would say the trendy line with d3. I would say that this is what I would play with white. I am playing this with white. And I'm going for the endgame. Many players are going for the endgame without thinking. And then after queen c7, I talked about this line, yeah? So I would research something here if I'm not playing for the advance. But I think you have to play the advance variation. If I'm playing with white, I would not go against any Tarta cover. Because the practice proves that it's so easy to play with black that white can just get worse after the opening, so I wouldn't do it. So what was again the question here? Here. Bishop f5, knight f3, here. White plays c3. And the question is, where to play c5? I mean, maybe don't rush with the c5 move. So think about pushing your pieces like this. Knight e7, bring the bishop to h7, knight e7, and then think about either c5, knight c6, or this knight on e7 can go to c8. To relieve the square on e7 for the bishop. Anything else? Actually, I think that the fantasy variation is pretty interesting because it's pretty rare, and when you are playing against a Caro player, I don't think he has a lot of fantasy games. I mean, the fantasy variation games. So basically, if I'm playing with white, I would not go knight c3. And if I'm playing faster time controls, I'm going for the exchange variation with bishop d3 and c3 because these plans are very easy to execute. But I wouldn't play these setups in a classical game probably. Although I have done it, I have played against even GMs in classical game. I have played the setup from the white's perspective. What do you do if you play knight e7, your opponent plays bishop g5 in the previous position? Why not in classical? Because it's easy to figure it out. I mean, you have time to figure out. So this setup is meant for easy plans. By the way, I think this is a bit too advanced, but the point is, in general, when it comes to what you choose to play for classical chess, what you choose to play for blitz chess. For blitz chess, like playing online, the best idea is to choose the setups that have the easiest plans, easy moves, where you don't have to like think for like 1 minute what's going to be my direction. But in classical chess, you're going for most principal continuations where you have the time to figure out details. This setup, the exchange variation, is all about simple plan. That's why when you look at the highest level, who is playing this setup at what time control, this is a super popular time control, a super popular setup at accelerated time controls, rapid and blitz, at any level. But basically, nobody at the highest level plays this in classical chess because black will figure it out. Again, doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the system. Is knight e2 good instead of knight c3? Yeah, but it just transposes. Yeah, that's exactly. I didn't mention this. In our case, it doesn't matter. You just take it to play knight f6. Same. So we are happy with the Tartu cover. No problem. It's a very solid setup. All right. Okay, listen. You can continue asking me questions if you want on Patreon. So the bootcamp is officially over. I will post the video on my YouTube channel in about a week. Something like that. On my Patreon, I will post it tomorrow. And for the supporters and VIPs, there will be the PGN as well. It's not necessary. It's just for those who are looking to study the Caro a bit more seriously. It's not going to feature, obviously, every single solution. It's meant to be like your first steps in the Caro. Maybe for players up to 1,000, it's more than enough. But obviously, it doesn't hold every single solution. Yeah, I'm tired. Yeah, I'm tired to do this Leon's game against Panov because my bootcamp already is running for 3 hours. You know, I wasn't expecting to do this. I have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, at least 10 model games. I did not expect it's gonna take for so long. Yeah, actually, one of my longest bootcamps I ever did was the Catalan. The Catalan, I think. Yeah, I also didn't explain the pawn structure. So many things I missed it. Yeah. All right. Listen, it's enough. It's enough.